Welcome, everybody, to the first day of our Alternative and Synthetic Fuels for Energy and Transportation Systems virtual workshop, sponsored by the University of Alaska Fairbanks, Alaska Center for Energy and Power. We're really excited to be here, and thank you for joining us. My name is Mari Shirazi. I'm a research professor at the Alaska Center for Energy and Power, and I will get to be your MC for both days of this workshop. And this is the fourth workshop in a series of four quarterly workshops in our Continuing Conversations virtual workshop series, where we're taking a bit of a deeper dive into important and timely topics leading up to the Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference in Anchorage this May. We started back in August with lessons in transmission planning, followed by the business of rural energy in October, and then beyond the basics, the potential role of advanced nuclear in Alaska in January. If you missed any of these, they're available online, and all of them are designed to lead into the 5th annual Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference, which will be held in person at the Dena'ina Civic and Convention Center in Anchorage, May 19th through the 21st. For this workshop, we are focusing on alternative fuels, and just a comment here. Seems like there's a lot of definitions of alternative fuels. What we mean by alternative fuel in this workshop is a fuel that is an alternative to what is currently being used in the majority of transportation systems, electricity generation, and heating applications. So, for example, a fuel which is common in one application but not in the other would be considered an alternative fuel for that application. We have 2 days. Day one agenda slide. It's being shown up there now. We'll start with some opening remarks, and we'll hear from the governor, followed by a session from researchers at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, providing an introduction to alternative fuels. Then we will have a session on alternative fuel production, looking at the various fuels, methanol, ammonia, et cetera, and how they're produced. Then in the towards the last session will be low temperature combustion of ammonia and hydrogen. Then we'll have some closing remarks, and we will move to day two. Day two, we'll kick off with a session on alternative fuel engines. We'll have a representative from Wärtsilä, as well as a company building a linear generator. Then we will hear from the Deputy Commissioner for Alaska Department of Transportation and Public Facilities about their plans for sustainable aviation fuel. And then we will hear from Caterpillar on I'm sorry, I misspoke. We will hear from Laurent, ASEP affiliated faculty on hydrogen and hydrogen blending case study. How it has been used in Hawaii and could it work here? Then we will hear from Caterpillar on hydrogen-fueled combined heat and power system. And then we will hear, we'll have two more panelists, and I'm sorry.
I think that's Tote there.
Okay, Tote, thank you. We will hear from Tote Marine on marine shipping application for alternative fuels. And then finally, we'll close out with a panel on alternative fuels for transportation. So that's it. And to get kicked off, we have a couple quick fun polls here. And you can use your phone and scan this QR code here, and it will bring you to a website where you can enter, where we have a couple questions to ask you. And so for the first question, where we are asking, which alternative fuel are you most excited about? And we list some of these we will be covering. Oh, wow. Okay. That was pretty quick. I have learned quite a lot about alternative fuels during the process of this webinar. I was asked to, introduced it earlier. I'm like, hey, it would be great if we had a workshop on alternative fuels. And then Gwen said, well, would you like to help organize it? Which was a bit terrifying, but I've learned a lot, so it's been fun.
Well, thank you, Mari, for taking the lead on organizing these. These are always quite a lot of work, and we've luckily got a really good team of folks with government event services. So,
yeah,
but hydrogen is like the winning out one here, huh?
Yeah, it didn't start out that way. The people who knew initially were methanol and ammonia. Okay, I think we are good now. It looks like hydrogen is the big winner, followed by sustainable aviation. Oh, wait, folks are okay. Hydrogen, ammonia, SAF, and then biofuels, methanol, other, and landfill gas are at the bottom here, which is pretty interesting because first methanol ammonia jumped up, but hydrogen ultimately is the winner. I wonder how that might change after today.
Maybe it's in honor of the Artemis rocket launch today, which I think is powered by liquid hydrogen, right? So,
So are there only 22 respondents or 23 now out of 260?
I'm not sure if we have 260 were registered. Typically we don't
Okay.
get all 260 attending.
I think what winds up happening is we get a lot of registrations because it's basically a free to join, and then a lot of people also just watch after the fact. So we tend to have like a very high proportion that watch the recordings later on. So yeah, it's a little bit of a diverse audience here.
Okay, I think we can stop there. All right, so the next poll question is, what do you think, which application do you think alternative fuels could have the greatest impact? Where could they have the greatest impact?
It's hard to just pick one.
Yeah, I'm pretty excited about space heating, but we may not be there yet. Okay, shipping, stationary power production, aviation, space heating a bit, transportation and other.
I think we're going to hear about all of them, except for maybe your space heating.
Yeah, yeah. We wanted to have an entire panel session on space heating, but it's not quite as that application is not quite as mature as some of the other ones. Okay, I think that's good. Shipping is the winner. Stationary power production and aviation, pretty close. Okay. Well, thank you everybody for participating in the poll. So just some housekeeping items. First, if you haven't already, please introduce yourself in the chat, give your name and organization you're with if you like. During each panel or after each presentation, we will have space for audience Q&A, and I will try to curate these questions. And so please go ahead and submit them in the chat as you think of them, and we will collect them and get to them at the very end. And again, be sure to submit them in the chat. We're not using the Q&A button here or the option for questions. If we don't get to every question, we'll do our best. Presenters and moderators will do our best to respond via the chat or follow up after the event. If you experience any technical difficulties during the virtual event, you can send a chat message to event support. Our technical team is on standby to assist you. Again, recordings of each of the virtual workshops are available on the Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference website at this link that event support will pop into the chat. Okay, and with that, before we get started with the main agenda, we'd like to play a brief video from Governor Dunleavy.
Good morning, and thank you all for joining us today. I want to thank the Alaska Center for Energy and Power and the University of Alaska Fairbanks for putting this workshop together and continuing this conversation as we head toward the Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference in May. Let me start with something simple. Alaska runs on fuel. Whether it's aviation, marine, transport, home heating, or power generation, fuels are what keep our communities moving and our economy going. And Alaska has a unique position. We're a major producer of oil and gas, but we also rely heavily on imported fuels, especially in rural parts of the state. That creates real challenges. It exposes us to supply disruptions and price swings that are outside of our control. So it makes sense that we take a hard look at additional options, especially ones that could strengthen our energy security and reduce costs for Alaskans. A lot of what we're talking about today, aviation, marine, remote power, these aren't sectors you can easily electrify. Fuels are going to remain part of the picture for a very long time. So the question isn't whether fuels matter, it's what kinds of fuels make sense for Alaska and how we get there. There's a lot of interest right now in biofuels, synthetic fuels, hydrogen, ammonia, and methanol. Some of these may fit into what we already have. Others would require new infrastructure. Some may work here, some may not. That's exactly why this discussion matters. There's no one-size-fits-all answer for Alaska. What works in one region may not work in another. So we need a practical Alaska-based approach, one that reflects our geography, our infrastructure, and the realities on the ground. At the end of the day, our priorities are straightforward. Energy that is affordable, reliable, and secure. That's what Alaskans expect, and that's what my administration has been working toward. I appreciate everyone being here and contributing to this conversation. So let's get started, and I hope to see you next month at the Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference in May.
Thank you, Governor, for the introduction. Okay, and we will now move to our first panel of the day, which is setting the stage and why is this important to Alaska. We have Gwen Holdman, who is Chief Scientist at the Alaska Center for Energy and Power, an applied research program at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and focused on community-scale fossil, renewable, and alternative energy technologies. Welcome, Gwen, and I will let you introduce your panelists.
Thank you, Mari. Wonderful. So this first panel is really designed to just get a bit of an overview from both the state and the federal landscape. I'm looking forward to a brief discussion with Andrew Jensen, who's been working for Governor Dunleavy, I think, since 2021. He actually was very involved in organizing the Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference. He's been working on that since pretty much the beginning. And he's now in a policy advisor role, in addition to continuing to work on the conference, working on both food and energy security. And so it's been a real pleasure to work with Andrew. He's been very involved across a wide spectrum of different topics. So I'm looking forward to hearing Andrew's overview of the state perspective. And I've got Mike McElhaney, who is joining us as well. He's the acting director for the Arctic Energy Office, where he specializes in international affairs and defense issues. Mike joined Department of Energy's Arctic Energy Office from the Office of International Affairs. I think, Mike, that's where I first got to know you. And you were working on Arctic issues at that time, too. So I know you've had a longstanding interest in the Arctic. And so I would like to turn it over. I think first, Andrew, if you want to go ahead and kick us off with a little bit of the state perspective, and then we'll move on to Mike. And then we like to have a little bit of a conversation, both between the two of you, myself, and any audience members that have some questions. Please drop it in the chat, as Mari mentioned, and I'll kind of curate those questions as well. So go ahead, Andrew. Let's start at the state level.
All right. Well, thank you, Gwen. And I do want to, thank you and the folks at ACEP. I mean, you and Jeremy, Mari, Michelle, putting these workshops together, like you said, is a lot of work. And we really couldn't do this without your support. And you've been so involved in the Sustainable Energy Conference since the beginning. And so I just want to really, thank you for that. And for the team, Sarah and Caroline behind the scenes, putting this all together as well. And just speaking of ASEC, I'd like to remind everybody, early bird pricing ends today at midnight. So if you haven't gotten your tickets yet, please go ahead and do that. We do have government rates. We've got rates for people from PCE communities. So please go to alaskasustainableenergy.com. I'm sure we have a slide somewhere in this. I hope we do. But I was going to get the plug in just at the beginning. This is the end of early bird pricing today. So go check it out and get your tickets. But I think the timing of this workshop is, I guess, significant considering what we're seeing right now with prices. The first year we did the Sustainable Energy Conference was in 2022, which was right after Russia invaded Ukraine. And I went back and I looked at some of the data from the PCE program in particular from back then. And the impact of that was, it was severe. The PCE utilities, I pulled the numbers, they purchase about 30 million gallons of diesel every year to power these communities. And so in fiscal year 2022, which was part of the Ukraine period, but that fuel had already been purchased. The utilities, and I saw Bill Stammes on, so he knows this, the $86 million is what they spent on their diesel fuel in that fiscal year. The next year it was $110 million on fuel. The year after that, fiscal year 24, $121 million. So that's about a 50% increase in fuel costs in just 2 years to our rural communities. So obviously that is a significant challenge for Alaska because the PCE reimbursements do not capture all those costs to the utilities, as I think we've seen in some earlier workshops this year. So here we are again. Prices are spiking once again, and the governor is well aware. I was in a meeting with him just a few weeks ago. This is when communities are starting to make fuel orders for the fall. And so even if we have a resolution in the Strait of Hormuz, even if prices start to come down, we may have communities that have to lock in these prices at artificially high levels. And so this is obviously a huge challenge for Alaska, regardless of price. The logistics, safety issues of barging in 30 million gallons of diesel every year for PCE. I looked at Red Dog. It looks like they bring in about 15 to 18 million gallons of diesel to power that mine every year. The Anchorage Airport uses about 2 million gallons of fuel a day. So you're talking about serious numbers that, those prices impact the Alaska economy. They impact for, everything we do. Much like the rest of the United States. But because we rely on marine transport for a lot of this, the supply chain and the pricing of it does create vulnerabilities, as the governor just mentioned, there in his opening remarks. And it's not just a challenge, logistically or financially, but, budgetarily, the PCE spending for diesel. Going back to pre-Ukraine war, it was $27 million to the PCE program, the reimbursements. The next year, it jumped into I think 39. The next fiscal year, FY24, was 45 million. So it jumped about $18 million in just 2 years. And this year, if anyone's followed the budget, there wasn't enough money in the 5% draw from the PCE fund. And even though the PCE fund is worth about $1 billion, there's not enough money from the PCE fund to fully cover PCE expenses because they're projecting out at this increase in fuel prices. And in order to fully fund the program, there's going to be a draw from the general fund. Now, we are seeing a huge increase in revenue because of these. And so, we'll see what the legislature does to help, whether they can, fully cover that and not have to go to a pro rata. But again, it does not fix the vulnerability of our communities. And so obviously this is incredibly important to the governor that we consider to pursue these fuel alternatives, for a number of reasons. One of the greatest reasons is it's a huge wealth transfer out of the state. When you look at, 121 million on diesel fuel for the utilities, that's money that's gone. That leaves the state, in turn for very little benefit. Whereas, and I know that we're going to hear from people today and tomorrow the governor sees opportunity. They see it to produce those fuels, or a good chunk of those fuels, here in Alaska. I think that when you look at the sources of power we have, the abundance in things like geothermal or tidal or wave or offshore wind to produce these forms of fuel here in Alaska is a tremendous opportunity to keep money in the state, create jobs, create an economic sector in Alaska. And, you know, there's ebbs and flows in federal policy in terms of maybe the priorities on these fuels, but corporations and countries around the world, they've set certain goals to adopt alternative fuels. And we know that Alaska is a crossroads of the planet. We're fully capable of supplying sustainable aviation fuel, marine fuel along the Great Circle Route. So I know the governor sees these opportunities. I know people we're going to hear from today and tomorrow see these opportunities, who are actually pursuing them, to the point of groundbreaking and getting started. So I'm excited to hear from everybody today and tomorrow. And again, it's important to Alaska for a lot of reasons that we're going to get into, but with these the risks and the opportunities. And so I think that's what we're seeing today and going forward.
Andrew, just before we jump over to Mike, I'm just like, you just mentioned a whole bunch of different examples of different fuels and the applications in Alaska. Can you kind of clarify for the audience, where is Alaska? Because we, very much view ourselves as an oil, producing and exporting state. We have refining capabilities here in Alaska as well. Where are we, for example, you mentioned with the PCE communities, much of that fuel, as you stated, is imported from outside the state. And I don't know that people necessarily know that, right? What about some of these, like our heating oil, and what's being refined, what's being used here in the state versus what we're importing? Can you share that?
I'm not as sure on the heating oil. I mean, I know that, like, for example, a lot of people think we import, the unleaded everyday driver gasoline, but that is generally produced, most of it here in Alaska, and along with jet fuel. But there's still a tremendous amount of jet fuel that has to be imported. To the heating oil, I would imagine that a lot of that is being imported as well. I do believe that when I've, certainly it's barged up to Southeast. I know that when we've heard from Golden Valley at an event I was at last couple weeks ago, they mentioned, especially to think about their electric rates right now, reliant on diesel. I mean, that's right. I know you understand this, when that there's 7 transfer points for their fuel to get to Fairbanks. That's 7 vulnerabilities that they have to contend with. And so the more we can reduce the transfer points, the more we can produce in the state, and the more we can just transition away from it. And I think that's where you look at, like, the Alaska LNG project, where the governor's very excited about that, because there's so many opportunities that can flow that. Starting with potentially getting gas to Fairbanks, but even before it gets, you could build a spur line or a natural gas plant or convert homes to natural gas heating. Simply producing power with the gas in South Central can move it up the intertie into Fairbanks, and you could see conversion away from heating oil into electrified heat in Fairbanks, potentially in advance of some of these other things coming online that I know people in Fairbanks really want, as I follow along with the legislative discussion right now. So don't want to get ahead of myself, but I would guess that a lot of that heating oil is being imported into Alaska.
Yeah, that's my understanding as well. And I know I'm up here in Fairbanks, and I just paid $5.50 a gallon for heating oil last week. So just to give some perspective there. So Mike, I'm going to turn it over to you. Give a little bit of the federal landscape perspective, if you don't mind.
Hey, thank you, Gwen, very much. And I want to thank everybody at ACEP and the university for putting this on, to the governor's office for organizing the conference, and to the governor himself for his opening remarks, which I am violently in agreement with. So I will start with 2 caveats. One, I cannot speak for the federal government, but only for my small, narrow wedge of it. And secondly, any misstatements I make are purely my own and not those of any federal department or agency. But if I'm right, I'm speaking for everybody. But if I'm wrong, I'm not. This is before I kind of follow on where Andrew said, I just wanted to say this is a really historic day to be speaking on sustainable fuels. America returns to the moon today with Artemis 2 launching later this afternoon, a truly historic event bringing America and one Canadian back to the moon. And powered entirely by a hydrogen fueled rocket. The SLS, and it goes to show that there is no right or wrong fuel. The right fuel is the one available in the quantities you need at an average price you can afford, and I think that informs everything that goes on at the Department of Energy. There is no desire to. And I'm glad we've moved away from this language of replacing or retiring. It should be supplementing and expanding, increasing useful energy use while reducing costs and increasing efficiency. And I think you're seeing that across the board. Andrew mentioned and Gwen mentioned the imports of fuel from fuel and specialty products from outside Alaska. I think the events of this week have shown that there should be no need for anywhere, especially Alaska, to be importing fuel or specialty products from anywhere outside of North America, especially in this day and age. Our adversaries, our opponents are out there seeking to interdict and reduce the use of energy by the United States and its allies. And I think building out resilient, sustainable networks for fuel production and distribution are very, very useful. So you will see a continued push to increase domestic production of refined and specialty products. You will see an increased push to move away from critical path dependencies that harm communities and ratepayers. And I think you'll see a continued push to increase the national security of our energy supply chains. I almost wish the conference was called the Secure Energy Conference and not the Sustainable Energy Conference. I think it'd be more fitting and appropriate, but that's not my call. But across the board, all of the above is on the table, but none are in the process of being replaced. They are all being secured, expanded, and made more affordable is the goal, I think, of our department and certainly of our office within it. So happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mike. I really like your comments about, we're talking about really addition, not replacement. I think that's a really good way to think about it. Yeah, I guess when you were talking about the Artemis rocket, I was thinking for those Andy Weir fans out there, it's too bad we don't have astrophage, because that would maybe be the way we could power our rockets. But I guess a question I have for both of you is like, where do you see this transition as being most important, or where could we get there the quickest for Alaska? Like, where does Alaska have sort of a unique need or a unique kind of opportunity space where we could be working with the federal government to really accelerate our efforts in this kind of area? Mike, do you want to start with that?
Certainly. I think there are some key areas in the future. I don't want to ruin the next panel, but I think replacing imports of foreign specialty products is absolutely important. But I will defer. I see JR and Mike. I'll defer to them because they are the experts. Other areas where I could see Alaska really benefiting. I think you will see a tremendous increase in usage of the Pacific Spaceport and hopefully of Poker Flats over the next decade or two. The availability, as I mentioned with Artemis, of hydrogen, the availability of specialty fuels for those rockets and platforms, which can be a variety of sources. I mean, it's not just hydrogen. It could be RP1. It could be high-grade kerosene. It could be unique fuels that require special handling. Almost none of those are produced in Alaska currently, right? Almost all of those are imported. Really building out that space supply chain, and everything will be space. Again, even if we weren't talking on Artemis Day, space is very much the future of economic growth in so many areas, including Alaska. Meeting that demand is a real opportunity. And related to that, as Andrew already mentioned, replacing transportation fuels for aviation and maritime. Ted Stevens Airport is one of the largest consumers of aviation fuel in the United States or in the world. Alaska, of course, is the key to global aviation, as Billy Mitchell prophesied over a century ago, as everybody at the Pentagon will tell you. I think their increased ability to meet needs with both traditional and with sustainable fuels, if they're available, meets almost unlimited demand. And on the maritime side, I think, as Andrew mentioned, the move towards alternative fuels in maritime is still continuing, globally. And you'll see more dual fueled ships, more dual fueled vessels calling and serving in Alaska ports, both U.S. flagged and foreign flagged. We already have dual fuel vessels serving the port of Anchorage, of course. I think meeting those demands from Alaska is entirely possible, and the demand for vessels to be able to refuel there with the fuels of their choice is very much a growing need. Every ship that fills up outside of Alaska carrying fuel to and from that doesn't bunker in Alaska is effectively an invisible import, right? A lost earnings opportunity that's not even on the ledger books, right? Because you never saw it, but it's a lost earning. That's reversible, that's changeable, and I think that is a source of market demand in the future. And we've invested an enormous amount of effort in the maritime energy side at DOE.
Thanks, Mike. And I encourage you guys to drop any questions that you might have in the chat, along with where you're from and what you're interested in. But Andrew, I'm just going to go back to you here. Mike just mentioned, I think you said this earlier, the Ted Stevens Airport is one of the largest cargo airports maybe anywhere in the world. And a lot of that is about our geologic, location, our physical location. But it is also something that, as the industry sort of moves in this direction, like, to what extent do you think it's important for us to be looking at these sorts of alternatives to sort of maintain our kind of our leadership in those kinds of areas? Any thoughts on that?
Sure. Well, I do think this is an area, and we're going to hear from Catherine Keith with DOT tomorrow. So I would encourage people to get that. And I think she's got an exciting update on where they're at. So I think that's an example where the state is taking the lead role in first, gauging the interest. And Commissioner Anderson, to the legislature earlier this year, said that, the letters of interest they've received from carriers, passenger and cargo, is something around 300 million gallons a year that they would be interested in purchasing if it was available. And of course, the price matters as well. And you're right, that think of dual fuel ships or looking for alternative marine fuels. The supply's not there yet. And, when we got to go over to UAE last year, we got a chance to sit down and meet with, the leadership at Emirates Cargo, which is, again, one of the largest operations in the world. And they have internal goals for a certain percent of SAF. You can't get it anywhere. So they're kind of like, we're not really worried about meeting that goal if you can't get it. And so I think based on, you have 36 cargo carriers, including the biggest ones in the world, transiting through Anchorage every single day. It's a tremendous market opportunity. And as I understand it, there's growing military interest in some of these fuels. And it's a little different. It's, I think in the past you were looking at defense policy that was oriented towards decarbonization as sort of the policy. And this is not about that. It's more about lighter weight and energy density, et cetera. To where it's a national security priority. And so if you actually had defense applications for these fuels as well, Alaska's opportunity, like you said, is virtually unlimited to produce and supply these fuels. And so, and I know we're going to hear from JR again. Mike mentioned that too, coming up. I know he's got some exciting things to talk about. But the state through ADA is also a partner in that project. So I think where you look at things like the methanol production or trying to lead the way on SAF with, refining capability, et cetera, the state is being proactive. There are things happening right now. It's not theoretical. So between the private sector and some state initiatives, we are pushing these things forward. They do take time, but but things are moving.
Yeah, it's interesting. We obviously have some J.R. Wilcox fans here, and we are going to hear from him a little bit later. But when it comes to methanol, like the way I used to think of methanol, it's like the fuel I would put in for de-icing my gas, or like I use it in my dog cooker, my dog sled. I have a dog sled team. We go out mushing. I'm always trying to get methanol and buy it by the gallon if I can, or buy a little big chunk of it so that we can use that out on the dog trail because it burns really cleanly. And it was interesting to me to know that like we have been historically importing all of this methanol, and there's like fairly like a large important uses of it up on the North Slope. And so this idea of having an entrepreneurial Alaskan that's looking at like how can we actually manufacture this in-state for in-state uses, which I think, Mike, is exactly what you're talking about. We want to be replacing these fuels that we would otherwise be importing. How can the federal government support entrepreneurs like that in Alaska that are looking at trying to find these develop these processes for developing replacement fuels? What can the federal government do to support entrepreneurs like that?
Wow, that is a great question. Well, I will say Alaskans have never been hesitant to reach out to Washington and let us know about great inventions and great opportunities. Our phones don't stop ringing. So I think people are good at that on their own. But seriously, DOE has multiple opportunities for funding. Our largest office that does so, and I'm taking their name in vain, but our Energy Dominance Financing Office has tremendous loan opportunities on both the normal and the tribal side to foster innovative and important investments across the energy field. So that is our largest financing office. Our Vehicle Technologies Office works very hard on sustainable aviation fuel and maritime fuels, and they have a number of grant programs, which are too many to list here. But I want to say everybody on here to reach out to me. My email is on the web. I'm here. Everybody on this call knows how to get a hold of me. Please feel free to reach out at any time. So I mentioned our Vehicle Technologies Office. Within AE, we just completed our Arctic Seeds program. The announcements on that should come out very soon. That's very much smaller scale energy innovation, but it is there. But I mean, the main thing really is reach out and talk and see where that opportunity could receive encouragement. And again, I think we get that. The larger thing to foster. The one thing also to foster that demand, it's really demand side, right? And it's not an Alaska thing, but it's a national thing. Don't talk about. Oftentimes I see projects approach and they're like, well, it will reduce usage by so much. And I think that's the sort of thing that when Secretary Wright spoke last year at ASEC, he mentioned, we're not in the business of reducing usage. We're in the business of improving efficiency and improving security and improving affordability. So focus on how it meets demand growth, how it meets load growth, how it meets improving national security, not about reducing total energy usage, which is actually counterproductive on a macro scale. But I'll get off my high horse now.
Yeah. No, that's great. And thanks, Mike. I mean, the Arctic Energy Office, a lot of what you are doing is you're trying to be like a little bit of a conduit between Alaska and all of these different opportunities and resources that the federal government, Department of Energy, but more broadly, can kind of bring to bear on some of these opportunities and challenges that we're facing here in the Arctic. And with that being said, I'm kind of curious too. A lot of our other Arctic countries, especially over in Europe, they've been doing a lot with diversifying fuel supply and looking at alternative fuels. To what extent can we look toward other places in the Arctic for lessons learned or things that we can adapt or bring back here to Alaska? Any thoughts on that?
Oh, there are multiple examples in the Arctic. Obviously Norway is blessed with absolutely enormous oil and gas reserves, tied with Alaska at a minimum. And they've been tremendous investors in transportation technology, and on Arctic oil and gas development technology as well. And they've moved ahead on electric shipping. They've moved ahead on alternative fuels, again, financed out of their own resources and meeting their own local needs. Denmark, of course, is, besides being associated with Greenland and the Kingdom of Denmark, is also home of the world's largest shipping company. So if it comes to marine fuel innovation, it starts and stops in Denmark. Sadly, our U.S. flag fleet is slowly recovering, but might take a few centuries to catch up with Denmark. Denmark is a tremendous energy fuels leaders, again, meeting the demands of their literal largest industry and the popular demands. And then I would say, in Canada, I think everybody in Alaska can take a look at Canada and say, well, we're doing better than they are. Being pro-growth, being pro-economic development has advantages. And I think many of our friends, allies, and partners in Canada look to Alaska as an example of what they should be doing rather than the other way around. So yeah, all of those are great things to look to in the Arctic.
All right. Well, I think we're about ready to wrap up and go into our little bit of an overview panel. So does either one of you have any last thoughts or comments? Andrew, I see you're unmuted before we pass it back to Mari.
No, I really appreciate the conversation. And setting the stage. I think it's gonna be a really interesting couple of days with this, and I think just on the topic of sort of learning from other Arctic nations. They're nations. We're a state, and so that's, I think, and I certainly know where our congressional delegation has been pounding the table for years in DC about we're an Arctic nation. And I think when you see things like the establishment of an Arctic Energy Office, when you see more defense and more federal focus on Alaska and what being an Arctic nation means, I think that's certainly where Alaska has now an opportunity to actually, fully sort of leverage and utilize the federal government to where we can get policies in place that we can't do on our own as a state. Certainly as a state through our resources and stuff, we can partner with private sectors on certain of these things, but a lot of stuff really does flow from a federal level, where Norway can make decisions, Denmark can make decisions, Alaska still has to ask permission for some things, right, or needs some assistance. And so I think the shift in federal policy across administrations, Democrat to Republican, at a recognition of Alaska as making us an Arctic nation and what that means. And I think the current administration certainly gets it as putting a focus. And so again, we have a real opportunity to take advantage of that. And so I do think that that's where we're seeing things happening now.
Well, thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Mike, for joining us this morning. And I think I'm going to pass it back to you, Mari, to go ahead and introduce our next panel.
Awesome. Thank you, Gwen, Andrew, and Michael. I tend to be a weeds person, so I really appreciate the big picture, both the national and the state level. It's great to set the stage for the rest of the workshop. Okay, so our next panel is a little bit more of a technical panel. This is a panel on introduction to alternative fuels, introduction overview. For our panelists today, we have Jim Shebest and Mike Cass, both from Oak Ridge National Laboratory. Jim is the head of the propulsion science section at Oak Ridge, and this section works on engine combustion and efficiency research, exhaust emissions, catalysts, and the utilization of alternative fuels. And Mike is in the Fuel Science and Engine Technologies Research Group, and Mike has over 25 years of experience in the fields of dynamometer-based engine testing, combustion emissions research, engine materials, and alternative fuels. So welcome both, and look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thanks, Mari. So as Mari said, I'm Jim Shebest here at Oak Ridge National Lab, and I'm just going to go through some high-level alternative fuel material that I put together, or we put together. Before I get going, though, I always like to acknowledge my sponsors at the Department of Energy. Most of our support comes from the Off-Road Rail, Marine, and Aviation program. That's part of the Transportation Technologies Office, formerly known as Vehicle Technologies Office. And there's work here from the what used to be the Bioenergy Technology Office, but it's been realigned into the Alternative Fuel and Feedstock program. So without the support from these sponsors, none of this would be possible. And what I'll be presenting today is a full team effort from many contributors at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. I always think it's useful to start with our mission at Oak Ridge National Lab, where our mission is not to sell gadgets or widgets. Our mission is to deliver scientific discoveries and technical breakthroughs that will accelerate the deployment of solutions in energy and national security, and in doing so, create economic opportunity for the nation. We are a laboratory that has about 7,400 employees, and we do work with collaborators. We have about 5,500 research guests annually. And what the National Laboratory System is known for at large, Oak Ridge being one of them, is our big science tools. We have the nation's most diverse energy portfolio. We have two of the world's most intense neutron sources, including the most intense at our high flux isotope reactor, where we do a lot of basic physics work. And we do a lot of computational work here as well. We have the computer called Frontier. It was for a time the world's fastest computer. It was the world's first exascale computer. And our output is not through devices that we sell, it's through knowledge. So we put out a lot of journal articles, have a lot of invention disclosures and patents. And we know, since we don't deliver things, we have to work with industry to get our work out into the hands of people who can turn it into consumer products or business products or things that can make a difference in the world. So we do a lot of collaborations. Okay, as Mike McElhaney pointed out, our direction here at Oak Ridge National Lab, because we are a federal entity, or we work for the Department of Energy, which is a federal entity, it's set by the Secretary of Energy, Chris Wright, and he's really prioritizing increased energy availability and reduced energy costs. He sent out a memo, it was over a year ago now, but it really still sets the direction of the department, where points out that energy is the essential ingredient that enables everything we do, and a highly energized society can bring health, wealth, and opportunity for all. And to compete globally, we must expand energy production and reduce costs for American families and businesses. So I hear about expanding energy production, and I think about alternative fuels, and we've got a lot of domestic resources here that can play into that. And the fact is that energy matters. We need more of it, not less. And going forward, the department's goal will be to unleash the abundance of American energy. So my background is in transportation. I've done a lot of work in the transportation field. And I think we need to look at what fuels transportation. And this is going way back to 1950. And you can see from the decade of the 50s, there was still some coal contributing to transportation. There's not that much coal contributing to transportation now, but you can see in the blue, it's largely petroleum that powers transportation. The natural gas sliver here throughout, this is really natural gas that is being burned to move natural gas and natural gas pipelines. When you think of on-road transportation or airplanes, natural gas doesn't really play a role. So this is really natural gas being burned to move natural gas. And then when we look at renewables, we see this blue slice coming in the early 2000s, and it's making up a growing, it's paled by comparison by petroleum, but it's a growing fraction of the total energy use in transportation. If you click one step further and say, okay, what types of biofuels are we producing in the United States? Well, ethanol represents the majority of it. That's the orange here. It accounts for about 76% of all of the biofuel production. But just from the map at large, you can see sort of 2005 is when we saw ethanol production really kick up in the United States. After that, we see this purple, which is renewable diesel. And I kind of lump renewable diesel and biodiesel together, and I'll talk about why. But renewable diesel has increased dramatically since about 2021, and now it's nearly 2 times the volume of biofuel and biodiesel. And biodiesel is another product here. It plateaued in 2016, and now it's sort of been constant. The reason is that biodiesel and renewable diesel have essentially the same feedstock, or a lot of overlap in feedstock. But that's our second biggest category. Everything else that you hear about, the other biofuels, they account for about 1.6 of the volume of the total biofuels. This includes SAF, or sustainable aviation, or synthetic aviation turbine fuel, SATF. Counts for biobutanol, counts for renewable gasoline or naphtha, as well as biointermediates. So when we get down into these other volumes, in terms of the volumes that they're being produced at now, those volumes are fairly low. I wanted to understand where Alaska stood relative to other states in the country. So, and in terms of alternative fuel use. So if you compare to Alaska to other similarly sized states in California, you can see, well, California is obviously a much bigger population, but if you compare Alaska to other similar sized states and districts, you see North Dakota and the District of Columbia are most similar to Alaska in terms of population, and then Vermont is just a little bit smaller. So if we take these states as a subset, how much transportation energy do these use? And setting aside California, and on a per capita basis, California is very similar to Vermont, actually. But North Dakota uses a lot of transportation energy per capita, but Alaska is even larger per capita. So that makes sense. A lot of rural communities, a lot of long distances to travel. There's a lot of transportation energy being used in Alaska. But if we look at how much of the biofuels or the alternative fuels are being used in Alaska, it's virtually none. So we see North Dakota, which is in the Midwest, lots of farming states, lots of corn, either in North Dakota or nearby. They use a lot of ethanol in transportation energy. Alaska, whatever is there isn't showing up on this scale. And similar with biodiesel and renewable diesel added together. So Alaska really is not using ethanol or biodiesel or renewable diesel in its transportation system. If we look for the reasons why, and I'm not an expert in Alaska, but I think this makes a lot of sense to me, is if we look at how much farmland is in Alaska, and when we talk about biofuels, we're really talking about the agricultural derived fuels for the most part here. Alaska does not have a lot of farmland compared to, especially, say, Iowa. It doesn't say that there's not a potential for Alaska to produce a lot of bio-derived fuels, because Alaska has a lot of woody biomass resources that could be available. Shipping alternative fuels to Alaska is expensive. And then biodiesel has very poor cold flow properties. Essentially, it would gel up under a lot of conditions. Alaska, I believe, uses a lot of number one diesel fuel, if not exclusively number one diesel fuel, whereas the majority of the country uses number two diesel fuel, which is a heavier product. And biodiesel is even heavier than number two diesel fuel. And then shipping ethanol to Alaska would be complicated. Most of the gasoline is made as bob or blend stock for oxygenate blending in this country, and it becomes a finished gasoline when you put ethanol into it. And that ethanol is added at the terminal. So the pipelines transport the bob, and then the ethanol is added to it at the terminals and taken to the gas stations. And the reason for that is ethanol is not pipeline compatible, and causes a lot of issues in pipelines. In terms of shipping, I think you would see very similar things, but essentially you've got to segregate the ethanol and the gasoline, or the Bob, until the last steps in the process. So I think that's another reason why there are difficulties there. Okay, let's talk about ethanol for a little while. Where does ethanol come from? First off, in the U.S., it's like I said, it's our largest biofuel product, our largest alternative fuel product. We make over 16 billion gallons per year of corn ethanol. Corn is by far the biggest feedstock. It's called first generation bioethanol. And we use the starch from corn. We also use some sugarcane. There are also second generation biofuels or bioethanol, where we are using more of a woody or cellulosic feedstock. And for that, we're looking at agricultural residuals like corn stover or wood residues. And you basically have to do a pre-treatment step, a hydrolysis step, but you get to the same fermentation process. So you ferment it just like you would in a beer making process, and then you dry and separate that ethanol, and that's where your fuel comes from. So nationally, ethanol is about 10.6%, so over 10%. Most of the gasoline sold in this country is E10, in the lower 48 states at least. But there's an ongoing push towards E15. E15 was legalized as a fuel in 2011. And it was legalized as a fuel for 2001 and newer passenger vehicles, as well as in flex fuel vehicles. And today, 90 to 95% of light duty vehicles are model year 2001 and newer and compatible with that. Ethanol is also seen as something that can improve the value of the gasoline. When you first add ethanol to gasoline, or a hydrocarbon, that's gasoline boiling range, you see a really big octane number boost. And octane is really expensive for refineries to make. It's more energy intensive, more costly. So refineries are really depend on that ethanol to bring up the octane number of the hydrocarbons to where it's in the acceptable range for motor vehicles today. And that's what this plot is showing. So you get this nonlinear octane boost when you add ethanol to gasoline, and it helps make the business case and it helps consumer acceptance. Okay, there has been this barrier to more widespread E15 consumption in this country, and it's around the vapor pressure. EPA limits vapor pressure because of evaporative emissions for air quality. And here we can see the left is 100% gasoline, or the hydrocarbons. And as you add ethanol into the fuel, you start to see a boost immediately that comes to a max around 5 or 10%, and then starts to gradually decrease. So it's a nonlinear trend. The RVP, or vapor pressure, of E10 is actually higher than that of E15, but the way the E15 or E10 became legal, the EPA granted a 1 PSI RVP waiver for E10. This came through the 2007 piece of legislation, the Energy Independence and Security Act, but this doesn't automatically apply to E15. So it effectively limits the sale of E15 during summer months. There has been a lot of recent movement and a lot of recent efforts to make E15 legal. The White House issued an executive order saying the administrator of the EPA shall consider issuing emergency waivers for E15. And that's just what they've done. They did that in 2025, and they are just signaled that last week that they would do this for 2026. But this isn't, again, signaling that this is going to reduce pressure at the pump, prices at the pump, and send a clear signal of demand for biofuel producers. This is not the greatest way to do policy because these emergency waivers last for 20 days, and these are the emergency waivers that were issued in 2025, and there was a similar series of waivers in 2024, 2023, and 2022. So it's not a given that this will continue. But there have been some other actions as well. A number of states got a permanent waiver for E15 granted. These are the Midwest states that produce a lot of ethanol. So in these states, E15 is legal year-round. Similarly, California is still studying what E15 is going to do to emissions. But last October, they signed a piece of legislation saying that because they want to do something for costs now, they will allow the sale of E15 year-round, while CARB, the California Air Resource Board, is continuing to study compliance there. Okay, next, moving on to methanol. So methanol is really interesting because it can be produced from so many sources. Most of the methanol in the US is produced from natural gas, but you can also make methanol from renewable natural gas. You can make it from coal, and this is what China does a lot of. You can make methanol from just about any biomass, and you can also make it from CO2. So there was a lot of research in CO2 hydrogenation processes to make methanol. So methanol is a pretty basic chemical, and there are a lot of routes to being able to make it. So the opportunities with methanol really stem from the fact that it's one of the most widely produced chemicals around the world. And this is one of the reasons that it's been looked at for shipping so widely, is that it's so readily available and it's stored at a lot of ports around the world. There's over 100 million tons a year of methanol produced. It's available as a commodity chemical all over the world. And there's a route to convert natural gas to support the transportation sector. And I think this is something that's really important. Natural gas is something that the US has in abundance. It's a large quantity chemical fuel, but it hasn't made much of a dent in the transportation sector because it's a gas and it's harder to handle for on-road transportation. If we convert that to a liquid fuel, if we convert it to methanol, just handling that liquid produces fewer challenges. Methanol also has challenges in and of itself, though. Fuel properties are different from diesel, making it more challenging to ignite in compression ignition engines. It's more naturally a gasoline or spark-ignited fuel, but a lot of the applications, the heavier applications that it would be useful for, are compression ignition engines. Its material compatibility is always a challenge, especially if we're looking to use it, modify an existing engine and use it. That can be challenging. And its volumetric density is about half of that of diesel, meaning you need a fuel tank that's about twice as large to do the same utility. But there have been a lot of investments in methanol consumption for marine use, and it's on the rise. So more than 100 methanol-compatible vessels have either been ordered or delivered. Nearly all of these are dual fuel technologies where they don't necessarily need methanol to operate. They can operate on diesel fuel or bunker fuel, but they're using the methanol when it's available. And Maersk has ordered 24 of these. I think they've already taken delivery of 11 of these and started sailing in 2024. So this brings up an interesting synergy between methanol and ethanol in the marine space. So methanol and ethanol have a lot of very similar chemical properties, and there are a lot of dual fuel vessels, a lot of which are methanol. But there's been a lot of noise recently about using ethanol in marine applications, and the International Maritime Organization has been including this in an assessment, and the Renewable Fuels Association has come out in support of ethanol in marine, and it introduces a really interesting dynamic where a ship could bunker with methanol in China or Indonesia and then bunker with ethanol in the United States. But thinking about methanol again, this is an area where Oak Ridge National Laboratory is actively engaged in using methanol in compression ignition engines. We are working with Caterpillar as part of a collaborative project on this. And you essentially need to figure out a way to get the diesel fuel to ignite. And in this, we're actually reforming a portion of the methanol to dimethyl ether. It's a very standard chemical process. And that dimethyl ether is essentially acting as an ignition aid to allow the methanol to behave like a diesel fuel. And what we're seeing is very promising: high engine efficiency, low engine out NOx emissions. So it's a very exciting process. Oak Ridge National Laboratory is also interested in the emissions coming out of alcohol-fueled vehicles. One of the challenges here is that alcohols readily convert to their aldehydes, and aldehydes are toxic. So think formaldehyde, think embalming fluid. If we look at methanol going into a catalyst versus the gray here is the diesel fuel, methanol lights off at a lower temperature, so that's good. And if we look at the bottom chart, we can see, yeah, that methanol is converting a little bit to formaldehyde, but it goes away at a pretty low temperature. The red, though, is the ethanol. We start to get it to light off pretty early over an exhaust catalyst, but it lingers around until very high temperatures. And what it's doing, that ethanol is being converted to acetaldehyde, and it's sticking around to much higher temperatures than the diesel fuel would. So there's still some challenges to sort out here. Okay, compression ignition fuels, biodiesel and renewable diesel fuel. So biodiesel and renewable diesel, I lump them together because they share a common feedstock, but they're processed differently. And so they have some different fuel properties. So when I say share a common feedstock, I'm talking about oil feedstock. So think oil seeds, soybean, rapeseed, canola, corn oil. But you can also have used fryer oil go into making biodiesel and renewable diesel, as well as animal waste, so tallow and animal processing plants. For the biodiesel, you go through this process called transesterification, and you just add a little methanol and elevate the temperature a little bit. Chemically, it's a pretty simple reaction, and you essentially just decrease the viscosity of the fuel. And right now, you can put 5% biodiesel into diesel fuel, and per the specifications, that's still diesel fuel. But there are separate ASTM specs for higher concentrations of biodiesel fuel. The challenge, though, is that it has poor cold flow properties, and but the advantage is it has a low production cost. Alternatively, you can take the same feedstocks and send them through something that's much more like a refinery operation, a hydrotreating operation where you're adding hydrogen. And renewable diesel is going to meet all of the specs of diesel fuel. So there's no separate spec for renewable diesel. It meets all the specs of diesel fuel, but it's more expensive to produce. And really, its use is limited to the states that incentivize using renewable diesel. If we look at historically how much renewable diesel and biodiesel are produced, it used to be back in 2021 that biodiesel was double the renewable diesel, but that's changed. Biodiesel stayed basically flat, and renewable diesel is now more than double biodiesel, and the forecast is for that trend to continue. If we look at where renewable diesel and biodiesel are used, renewable diesel is essentially used in 3 states because they incentivize it: California, Oregon, and Washington. And that's the dark part of the bars, and the rest of the bar is the biodiesel. So it's really concentrated in 3 states, and that's about all the only locations where it's available. But as of now, California has, say, 2/3 of their fuel use is renewable diesel. So that's quite a lot. At Oak Ridge National Laboratory, we are working on some of the challenges. There are still some challenges with biodiesel, and particularly looking at a catalyst after treatment durability. As we progress to lower and lower emission standards, people are looking at changing the configuration of the exhaust system. So NOx emissions are the challenge, and moving the SCR, this is selective catalytic reduction, so this is the DNOx catalyst, that is now going to have to be the first thing out of the engine. So any impurities in the biodiesel are going to hit this SCR catalyst first. And we've studied this in the past for on-road catalysts, which are mainly copper-based. But for off-road systems, those have a vanadium-based catalyst. And what we're finding has been really encouraging, and that's that these metals that are in biodiesel, so sodium, potassium, magnesium, and calcium, they really sit on the surface of a vanadium-based catalyst rather than penetrate into the catalyst. And this allows the majority of the catalyst to operate the way that it was intended to. Okay, next talking about ammonia. There's been significant interest by industry in using ammonia as a marine fuel. However, it does present some challenges for use in a diesel engine. Whenever I talk about ammonia, I want to just mention that ammonia is toxic. It's quite toxic, and getting to the point where we could use ammonia as a fuel at ORNL has been there's been a lot of effort put into it, and we're doing it safely, but I don't want to ever minimize the safety challenges with ammonia. That being said, on a ship that has a very controlled bunkering or fueling process, and these ships already move ammonia, it could be used, but this is not something that we want to get into the hands of everyday consumers because of its toxicity. But beyond that, it has challenging fuel properties. It doesn't readily auto-ignite in diesel engines, and it has low flame speed, high ignition energy. Basically, everything that you need to get it to burn, it's acting against you. That being said, there's been a lot of interest in the marine sector, and the first demonstration occurred in 2024, where the company Fortescue, which is a mining company I think centered in Australia, they demonstrated the world's first ammonia vessel in Singapore. Beyond that, some of the big engine manufacturers for marine have commercial offerings for ammonia engines. So Everlance, which is formerly MAN, has plans to deliver its first two-stroke dual fuel engine in 2026. And Wärtsilä is currently offering a four-stroke ammonia engine for marine. At ORNL, we have a project that we are looking at ammonia combustion, looking at everything from the premix combustion strategies to hydrogen-assisted combustion with ammonia, where we're decomposing some of the ammonia on board, to the emission control. Obviously, if you've got ammonia, it's got nitrogen in it, and so some of the NOx emissions can be very challenging with ammonia. With that, I'll hand off the next section to Mike Cass to talk about. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. So we're going to diverge a little bit and talk a little bit about fuel spills. I assume everybody can hear me? Yes? Okay, perfect. Okay. And really kind of maybe focus a little bit on what's going on in this space, because it's an area of quite a bit of study at the moment. But why should you be aware of biofuels in the maritime sector, especially in the Arctic region? Well, and Alaska in particular, well, ship traffic through the Bering Strait has really tripled since 2010. This increased traffic means the increased probability of fuel spills. And as a result, the IMO has issued regulations regarding or restricting heavy fuel oil or bunker use or high sulfur bunker use in Arctic waters for partly that reason, primarily for the particulate emissions. But biodiesels, especially or biofuels, especially biodiesel, are being explored as a means of meeting some current regulations, especially the Fuel EU maritime regulations that were recently enacted and are taking place. Even though these emissions these regulations are emission centered, in all practicality, what it translates down into is the use of increasing the use of biofuels to meet these emission targets that the EU has specified. In the future, alternative fuels may expand even further into the maritime sectors. The big caveat, the thing that's kind of the elephant in the room out there, is really the current volume of available biofuels are not really sufficient to meet the maritime demand at this moment. As a result, they're being introduced as blends, and because of the availability and maturity, biodiesel or the fatty acid methyl esters are really the near-term fuel of interest. There are folks also looking at what they call bioresiduals, which is a byproduct of the transesterification process for biodiesel, as well as some heavy fuel oil, hydrotreated fuel oils or renewable fuels, renewable diesel as well. So, but mainly most of it's biodiesel. Okay, Jim, go to the next slide. So both the National Academy of Sciences and the Arctic Council, aware of this, and they've actually issued reports stating the need to assess alternative fuel spill impacts as these fuels come into use. It's good to get ahead of the situation rather than having to be reactionary. And I guess I would guide you to a number of reports out there. They're pretty easy accessible out of the internet. One by the National Academy of Sciences, and then the PAIN working group of the Arctic Council has done work and is actively doing work in this space. Okay, next slide, please. So several years back, knowing that this was something they want to get ahead of, the Department of Transportation Maritime Administration asked us to explore the spill behavior and impacts of alternative marine fuels. And this is pretty much a high-level study. We really didn't get into a lot of the nitty-gritty, plume modeling type stuff that's very expensive and takes a lot of time. So we really just kind of focused on just kind of getting a basic understanding of the spill behavior, safety impacts, and then also very importantly, the effectiveness of the current spill detection methodologies, and then the existing containment and remediation methods that are out there as well. And as an outcome, we produced a number of summary charts. This is kind of like a very high level, what it's going to do in a given situation based on properties. And that report is out there and available for anybody that's interested in this. I would also like to point out that for those who aren't aware, the Department of Homeland Security is involved with what's called the Jackrabbit Project. And I encourage folks who are interested to look it up. But right now it has to do with the looking at, okay, if we're going to have vessels filled with ammonia or hauling ammonia, what's going to happen in the event of ammonia spill? The Ethanol Energy Association did a study, I believe, dated back to maybe the late 1970s, that did a pretty good analysis on this. However, trying to get an understanding of how things are going to affect, how spills are going to happen in say like a port location where there's a high population region has really kind of driven a lot of the Jackrabbit work that's going on. Okay, next slide, please. And this has really been the outcome. We looked at a wide range of fuel types, the ones that Jim mentioned, in addition to hydrogen and DME and a few others as well. We also looked at what we call the biointermediates, which are pyrolysis oils and oils produced by hydrothermal liquefaction. These are fuels we know quite a bit about, and of which there's a lot of property data. So we took for each of these fuels, we then went ahead and looked at what's going to happen, what's the immediate behavior when spilled, what is the dissipation or degradation rate, what are some of the known ecological impacts, the risks, whether it's a fire explosion, toxicity, potential for suffocation, the ability of spill cleanup technologies to work or not work, and then the kind of a very high level ranking of the detection probability with current practices. Let's see, next. So we did a case study in biodiesel, and this is something that is also being looked at by the European Union and also the Arctic Council as well. They're not, in the past, I think they coordinated their efforts a little bit more than they are now, but I think because the Arctic Council group is being led by Norway, which is not a European Union country, I think they're doing their work kind of independently. And this work really kind of, it kind of goes in line to what we've seen from the European Union, but we did one in-house as well, where we looked at biodiesel blends B30, B60, and compared it to a baseline VLSFO. Preliminary results under agitation to represent wave action, you see significant emulsification and densification. That's something that our colleagues in Europe have also been finding. We find that one of the things we did find, though, is that biodiesel promotes the dispersion of VLSFO into the surrounding water, meaning if you look at the bottom photograph there, if you look at the very left where it says VLSFO, you can see that there's while the oil slick is expanded as the water infused into the bunker fuel as an emulsion, you don't see the reverse. You don't see the bunker fuel going into the water column because it's very clear. In contrast, when you add biodiesel, you do see that. So that's important. It means that some of the microbes or the life that's near the biological life, marine life that's in close proximity to the spill is going to be affected. Whereas for just a straight spill of bunker fuel, it would be less so. However, biofuels, especially biodiesel, are generally a lot less toxic than petroleum-based fuels, and they also degrade faster. So you're putting in something that maybe diffuses into the water column a little faster. It's going to be less toxic, and it's going to degrade faster, but it's also going to have the disadvantage of maybe pulling some of the bunker fuel into the water column as well. Okay, next column. So similar research is being initiated by our colleagues at the Arctic Council and European Union. The initial emphasis is on biodiesel. In fact, I've not heard them talk about really looking at any other type of biofuels at the moment. And I think that has to do with the fact that biodiesel is just available, and they can get it in large quantities and they can throw it in. Biodiesel also has the wonderful quality of being very soluble with bunker fuels. So one of the risks when you add stuff to bunker fuel is the precipitation of asphaltenes, which is really the big compatibility driver for this fuel. For some reason, it just loves biodiesel. The solubility parameters of these two fuels align very well. And then we're also participating in the Arctic Council study as a partner with the Norwegian Coastal Administration, and that their effort is just getting started. I would also, for those who would like to see some results in this space, I would direct you to the EMSA report that's out there. It's available online. It's pretty thorough, very good study. Let's see, next slide. Yeah, I think that sums it up.
Thanks. So Mari, I guess we'll go ahead and take questions.
Yeah. We have some questions already, and that was a fantastic presentation. I really appreciated it. I had lots of questions in my mind that you answered. And I have some other questions, but I want to start with audience questions, actually. And so we have a couple here from JR. And the first one is for you, Jim. JR asks, I'm curious to know methanol's potential role in the gasoline mix, both as a blending agent with ethanol and by itself, for example, M10, and whether this could be important for Alaska.
Yeah, that's a difficult question to answer. I think a lot of that's going to come down to materials compatibility. And when ethanol was being introduced, and particularly when we were looking to go from E10 to E15, and I know some of my colleagues here at Oak Ridge were part of that. A lot of it comes down to what the material compatibility is. If an engine or if a fuel system is compatible with methanol, it's most likely going to be compatible with ethanol. But the reverse of that is not true necessarily. So I think there are some materials, some metals, and some elastomers that could be problematic with methanol. So I think that's one of them. Having said that, there has been a lot of work with particularly high octane fuels and being able to switch out ethanol and methanol. So a lot of the fuel properties are pretty compatible. And from an engine calibration standpoint, holding the oxygen concentration of the fuel constant. So that means a little less methanol. So if you have E10, maybe switching in 8% methanol for that could work. But I think there are going to be quite a few infrastructure and material compatibility challenges. And then also getting the manufacturers to buy in to continue to warranty a product using methanol could be challenging. So technically, it's less of a challenge, like getting the engine to work. It's less of a challenge than some of the material compatibility and actually getting the engine to run.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jim. And a question for JR. For Mike, I'm curious to know more about methanol spill risk in the Arctic. I was surprised that the flammability/explosive risk was listed as high when the water is so cold and methanol mixes and dilutes so rapidly. A similar question for the aquatic toxicity. I'd seen that it was a very low toxicity and rapidly mixed down to non-harmful concentrations that microbes would eat.
So I guess I'll answer the second question first. So I pulled that so the EPA publishes, they have a very thick report where they publish spills, and they're looking at, of course, they're looking at inland situations, not really the maritime situation, where they've looked at these different fuels or alcohols and, their toxicity. And of course, these are the results of very elaborate studies where they've looked at, in a controlled environment, how many fish die, microorganisms, how they're affected, and how it diffuses and degrades. So that information was pulled from the EPA tables. So I don't expect it to really change that much in the Arctic either, to be honest with you. Let's see. And then the first one had to do with methanol in the fire and explosion. So that's before it hits the water. Once it hits the water, it's going to it's going to go in the water. It's going to partition the water pretty quickly. And that refers just strictly above the water situation.
Great, thank you. And I think that these questions came from that great table that you had, which I need to look at a lot more closely. Okay, next question is for Jim. Can you speak to the cold weather performance of renewable diesel? I was going to ask this as well, and the benefits over biodiesel. Do you have pricing information for blends of renewable diesel with the cold weather additives?
Starting with the second question, no, I don't have any pricing information. But biodiesel and renewable diesel, it's a more expensive process than biodiesel production, and it's really limited to the states that incentivize it. In terms of the production, so when you look at biodiesel, if you start with a fat, and a carbon length of 18 is very typical for the fat. When you make biodiesel, you maintain that carbon length of 18. When you make renewable diesel, you get a lot more fractionation. And I think there are a lot more parameters that can be manipulated in the renewable diesel and the hydrogenation process to be able to manipulate the boiling range. I do know, for instance, you do get some renewable naphtha or gasoline boiling range products out of the renewable diesel manufacturing. So if you want to really go after a lighter boiling cut, it might be a little more intensive, but there are ways to do that. Anecdotally, I have heard of individual batches of renewable diesel being made and being sold in like Northern California, where it was colder, that did have some gelling issues. So there can be cold flow issues, but there can also be cold flow issues with petroleum diesel fuel. So I think you've got a lot more ability to tailor the actual carbon chain length and the So I think you've got a lot more variables to play with renewable diesel than you do for biodiesel.
Great, thank you. All right, another question. What is the energy usage / environmental impact of generating these fuels at scale? It's a broad question, but you can.
Sure. So I guess with ethanol and biodiesel and renewable diesel, I would say that we are already generating these fuels at scale. Nationally, we have over 10% of the gasoline pool is ethanol. We've got a lot of farmers in a lot of states that are dependent on producing that. And the yields have been going up year over year. There's been a lot of science that's gone into increasing the bushels of corn per acre. So I would say that we already are dependent on those as fuels, and those have expanded our domestic energy production. If you start to think about other fuels, there are a lot of, especially converting, say, forest area into farmland. There are a lot of considerations there, the use of the land, that sort of thing. But broadly speaking, we are already producing a lot of these alternative bio-based fuels at scale. With methanol, it really just depends on where you're getting the feedstock. From natural gas, we're already making a lot of natural gas, and it can be converted. We've got standard production processes. I think that's something that that could be done pretty readily there. But if you're talking about converting forest wastes or growing trees or woody crops to make biomass to make methanol, then that's there are potential pitfalls there.
I have a related question, which is, I didn't know you could make methanol from coal. We have coal here in Alaska. Like, do you think that it's, we could produce it here?
Sure. I mean, I think so. That route is to make syngas. You partially oxidize the coal, and you have syngas with carbon monoxide and hydrogen, and then it's a pretty simple process to turn that into methanol. And China has a lot of coal as a natural resource. They don't have as much natural gas, and they don't have as much petroleum, so they do make a lot of methanol from coal there. We used to make a lot in this country, so it's a well understood, well established process.
So we used to make a lot from coal, but we no longer?
We used to make some from coal. I know that. The relative quantities, I don't know. Maybe our quantities today are so much higher than they were 50, 60 years ago when that was more straightforward. But I think starting with natural gas, it's a pretty easy process.
Okay. We have a follow-on question about the gasoline mixing question. JR asked, what about methanol at lower concentrations, like 5% or 2.5%?
So again, I think from technical standpoint, from the engine operating, the combustion system, flame propagation, that sort of thing, there are not a lot of challenges there. Maybe Mike can comment on the material compatibility.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'll throw out there that, both China and Israel at one time added methanol to gasoline and were running in vehicles. And because of the coal and the natural gas. So it's been done. And when you talk about go back to the compatibility, methanol is kind of a tricky molecule. And there's really, I know that at one time everybody thought the issue was corrosion, but now I think they thought with regards to metals it may be more of a wear issue. But as Jim mentioned earlier, when you start talking about elastomers, methanol is a really small molecule and it likes to diffuse in things. And that's not necessarily what you really want at a high rate for a lot of your seals and hoses. So you have to be careful about what you select there. And in that instance, I think it's just a matter of switching out your seals and hoses to make sure they're compatible. Once again, Israel and China have done that. So it's not daunting.
I think one of the, just to comment on that a little further, One of the things that can get a lot of backlash when introducing a new fuel or an alternative fuel is if it's introduced and then people discover these challenges themselves. Like if they try to use a fuel in an engine that wasn't designed for it and it doesn't have the right seals, it can break down. When E10 was first introduced in the US, a lot of people were experiencing clogged fuel filters or clogged fuel injectors. And the reason wasn't that the new fuel itself was dirty, it's that there were a lot of stable deposits with the petroleum and the petroleum gasoline. And when you put ethanol in, it had different solubility properties, and it freed up a lot of these stable deposits that were already in the engine system and flushing them downstream, clogging up the fuel filter and the injector. So I think there's a lot to be said about being really careful when you're introducing a new fuel so that you don't encounter an unexpected problem that's going to garner a lot of backlash from the early adopters, because word of mouth about anti-alternative fuel can spread really fast, and that can kill a lot of these efforts.
Yeah, if I can expand on that just a little bit. So one of the things they found out when they started adding ethanol to gasoline was that the big underground tanks where they had all this, like Jim said, deposits and stuff on the bottom of the tanks. In a lot of instances, those deposits were covering over holes and cracks. And when they added the ethanol, it cleaned out all the rust and junk out of there. And then you had leaking tanks because, all the particulates that were sealing the tanks were now gone. So, one of the things that people didn't think about at first, that was kind of an issue.
Do you have perspective on what kind of testing, especially duration or guidelines, would be necessary for upcoming fuels to try to mitigate that, the customers finding the problems themselves?
So we've actually done quite a bit of work with actually Underwriters Laboratory. So UL actually lists fuel tanks and fuel system components, and maybe not on the vehicle, but they do at the dispenser. And so there's a lot of test protocols that have been developed by them just to look at that. And then as far as the vehicles go, we've just done some standard, volume swell type testing for elastomers, and then some corrosion stuff as well. The corrosion stuff is a little tricky because I don't think either ethanol or methanol really corrode, but they can be attacked by bacteria, which can form corrosion. I don't know if you've heard of microbial induced corrosion, but I know it's a real phenomenon with ethanol. With methanol, I'm not so sure. But there's test protocols out there.
And when it came to ethanol, Oak Ridge National Laboratory led the what was called the Million Mile Study. We looked at a fleet of vehicles, matched pair vehicles, to put a lot of miles on the vehicles and understand how they would perform under a long duration. So it wasn't just put them into the laboratory and get a quick check. And there were things that cropped up during that test that you wouldn't normally think about. So if the engine operated okay under normal conditions, one of the concerns was, well, what happened? How do the engine controls interact with the fuel at high load? So basically, when you floor it and you're accelerating down the road, and there were concerns about, whether the air fuel ratio control was closed loop or open loop. So was it looking for feedback from the oxygen sensor during that time or not? And that can make all the difference on whether or not the catalyst melted during those stretches or not. So the things that can really sink a fuel's effort can be pretty nuanced. And so there's got to be a lot of care taken to understand what the challenges are.
Okay, very good. We have another engine question. I'm very interested in your proposed engine design that utilizes methanol with DME reformation. Are there advantages to having an engine that can alter the properties of its own fuel mixture in real time that way?
Sure, there certainly are, and JR, I'm very interested and excited about this strategy myself. So with I think the dream of basically being able to bring any fuel that has any fuel properties and have the engine manipulate those, that might be a little far out of reach. But when it comes to this particular strategy, it really, particularly for methanol, it really is a way to say we only need to deliver one fuel to this engine instead of our methanol, and then we need some diesel fuel to ignite it. And managing two fuels for any application is really challenging. So I think there are some advantages here, and we've been working hand in hand with Caterpillar on this project. It's been a really great collaboration, but there are some advantages, and particularly with something like this reformation to DME. There are some advantages there of, depending on what the ambient conditions are and what the control strategy is, you can really change, you can turn that DME knob and make the fuel more ignitable and make it easier to ignite. So I think there are some real advantages there.
Okay, so we have 1 minute left. I would like to ask a question. As our last question, what alternative fuels have the most growth potential, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I'll start by saying, well, two sort of caveats here. Number one is it's hard to have niche fuels. So you want to have an engine company be able to make an engine that can run on whatever fuels it's going to see. You don't want to have an engine company make engines for a particular location. So if it's a fuel or a family of fuels, I think that's important. But I also think it's going to take all of the renewable fuels. Like I think there's room for renewable diesel, biodiesel, ethanol, and methanol. But particularly methanol, I think the fact that there are so many different ways to make methanol and that it's available so widely globally, to me, that's a really intriguing fuel to look at for the future growth.
Excellent. Well, thank you both. This was great. I was actually taking a lot of notes myself, and we'll probably have questions for you separately.
All right. Well, thank you, and thanks for the opportunity. I really enjoyed it.
Our next panel session is on alternative fuel production, and this panel session is moderated by David Lockard. David worked as an energy project and program manager for Alaska Energy Authority from 1994 to 2022, and he's been involved in their bulk fuel program. So I'm going to step back and let David take it away with his panelists.
Thank you, Mari. We've got 15 minutes or less for each of these presentations, so I'm going to move into them quickly. I'll start with Bob King. He is the president of Pacific Biodiesel, the company he founded on Maui in 1995. Pacific Biodiesel is the longest operating biodiesel producer in the USA and has been the only commercial producer of liquid biofuels in Hawaii for 3 decades. Please go ahead, Bob.
Okay. I'm on the island of Kauai today, in Hawaii. Happy to join you folks up there. Bob King, president of Pacific Biodiesel. We do biodiesel here in Hawaii, as you said, for about 30 years now. Mostly we're using used cooking oil to make biodiesel, but we have recently got into growing crops, both for culinary oil and animal feed on the meal, plus the oil for biodiesel. All the fuel that we make stays in Hawaii, it's really been a regional project here. And so one of the things about biodiesel first, my background, I'm a diesel mechanic originally, and then I got into making biodiesel. So I was well aware of what was going on with engines and engine technology. And so when the new high pressure common rail engines were being designed 10, 15 years ago, I really realized that we needed to change from our traditional biodiesel that we were making, which was fine, to some really, really clean, highly refined biodiesel. So we designed and built a new plant on Big Island of Hawaii that did distillation. And so you can see the biodiesel on the right-hand side of the screen. That's distilled biodiesel. It's clear like water. It's very pure, and it runs excellent in these new high pressure common rail engines. A lot of our customers have extended their fuel filter change life because there's just nothing. If they're running 100% biodiesel, there's just nothing in there it's just super clean fuel. It still has lubricity. It's still biodegradable, non-toxic, but it works in both the old and the new engines, and the new engines especially. And I'll show you some of the things that we put it in, but basically from boats, tractors, truck, and power generation. We did build a refinery in Anchorage a long time ago. This is it. Sorry, frog in my throat. But did it for Alaska Waste Solutions. So we were using used cooking oil they were collecting around Anchorage, made it into fuel, and then ran their waste trucks on the fuel. The one thing about biodiesel is that it does have a pretty high cloud point, around 0°C. So I thought that would be a no-go in Alaska, but turns out that folks up there have got pretty inventive about heating and protecting the fuel systems. So it actually wasn't even as bad as say Washington State, where people don't think about doing fuel line protection or engine filter heating. So it's a pretty versatile fuel, even for Alaska, and obviously more so in the summer than the winter. We also did a project a long time ago using fish oil out of Alaska. We sent it down to Hawaii, I think a couple of times, sent a tanker down, and then we sent the fuel back up to University of Alaska. And it's a real nice oil. It makes on-spec biodiesel. Maybe not the best value for the oil if there's nutraceutical properties for it, but certainly it is a viable feedstock to make biodiesel out of. The other and so the current cooking oil in Alaska, we actually get from another company, not Alaska Waste, another company. We actually get a tanker of cooking oil from Alaska, maybe once or twice a month, and bring it all the way to Hawaii. And then, of course, we use it here and keep it here. The problem with Alaska and biodiesel is that the state has opted out of the RIN program, the RFS program under the EPA. So while down everybody else is getting, over $2 a gallon in credits for selling RINs, that's not available for anything made in Alaska. So that's a economic drawback to producing renewable diesel or biodiesel in Alaska. It is a great fuel for greenhouse gas. So USC did a study, basically assessing an electric bus in Hawaii versus a biodiesel bus using our fuel. And you can see it's all the way down the list. The biodiesel bus was positive compared to the electric bus, and 48% less energy. This is life cycle now, not tailpipe, which California likes to just look at what comes out the tailpipe. But you have to look at if we're really going to solve greenhouse gas and put money into solving a greenhouse gas issue, you really want to look at the life cycle. And unfortunately, the life cycle of building the electric bus is pretty heavy. And then if you're running it on a grid that's 30 or 40% renewable, you still have fossil fuel component to it. So this is real. Biodiesel will get you much further towards your greenhouse gas goals than actually anything. California, if you're wondering how it works in engines, in California, about 75% of all the diesel fuel in 2025 was 100% renewable. So their fuel of choice down there is 80% renewable diesel, 20% biodiesel. That's the typical blend. And 75% of the fuel sold in California was this blend. Yeah, no issues. The regular customers really don't know any different. It's just fuel. That's what fuel is in California today. So when we look at, we've built maybe a dozen plants so far around the U.S. and other countries, and it's all about what do you have. So it's what works in Hawaii for us. It's not going to work in Alaska, and what works in Alaska isn't going to work in Arizona. So it's you look at in your area, and the idea is to use what you can come up with in your area to make this fuel as ideal. So in Hawaii, we do about 6 million gallons a year right now. We'd like to get up to 16 million.
So we're
Sorry. We'd like to get up to about 16 million, which is about 12% of the grid capacity. And we're going to do it with farming here because that's where we can expand our feedstock. And here's some of the places that we're using the fuel today, and these are applicable to Alaska. We put a lot of it into power generation, and remember, power generation, you can control the temperature of your fuel and your engine and your delivery system. So there's no reason you couldn't be running 100% biodiesel in any number of power plants in Alaska. This is a 50 megawatt Wärtsilä set at Schofield Barracks on Oahu. It's always run on 100% biodiesel. It's 6 or 8 years old now. Runs excellent. This is a combustion turbine set, GE LM2500s on Kauai. They also run biodiesel to start and stop the engines, and naphtha as the main baseload fuel. But these engines also will run on 100% biodiesel continuously. And they actually like the biodiesel better than the naphtha. Trucks, of course, the city and county has been on biodiesel for a long time. They do a B20, 20% biodiesel, and about over 1,000 vehicles, and no issues with performance. We do have, luckily, we have nice weather here, so we don't have to worry about the cold weather issues. But whatever it is, it's the circular economy. It feels good to be pulling product from our area, making it into fuel, using it back in our area, and then all the side streams that go along with that, food, fiber. But the reason we got to do this is the next generation. They're disappointed that they're not going to have the same opportunities we have and the same environment. And I think it's our job, all of us, to find a way to be more sustainable so that we leave something better for our next generation. And they deserve it. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. And we're going to save questions for the end. So I'll go on to our next speaker, Kelly Toth.
Okay, good morning, everyone.
Kelly, I'll do an introduction for you. She's the Director of Solid Waste Services for the Municipality of Anchorage. Solid Waste Services manages Anchorage's landfill and 3 transfer facilities with a focus on safety, efficiency, and innovation. Go ahead, Kelly.
Thank you. So today we're going to talk about a really cool exotic fuel. It's called trash. And I'm going to talk about our landfill gas system. So a little bit about solid waste services. We have a mandatory service area that we do curbside collections in the Anchorage area. It makes up about 20% of the total population. We also operate 4 different facilities. We have the Anchorage Regional Landfill, Material Recovery Facility, Girdwood Transfer Station, and also the Central Transfer Station. So 80% of what is buried in every single day comes through the Central Transfer Station first. And it's important to know that because it all goes here at the Anchorage Regional Landfill. And within there, we bury about 1,000 tons per day. So that's 2.2 million pounds per day, essentially, that every single day is buried and covered at the landfill. I'm sharing you these pictures because not everybody has visited the face of the landfill. This is what's called the working face. And it's important in the conversation of exotic fuel, aka trash, and gas generation, because all of this at some point is going to break down and generate landfill gas. So the different transfer trucks come to the landfill, and all of that MSW, or what's called municipal solid waste, is buried here every single day. So anything that you've ever thrown away within the municipality of Anchorage is in this landfill. And it is going to slowly break down from an aerobic condition to an anaerobic condition, which is where when the landfill gas and greenhouse gases are produced. At the material recovery facility, when we're talking about landfill gas, we look at ways that Anchorage can divert items from the landfill or organics from the landfill. And so we talked about efficiencies and innovation. And this is definitely one of our efforts to try to minimize the amount of organics going to the landfill. So the material recovery facility is open May 1st through October 30th, and anyone can bring organics, plastics for recycling, reuse, and then also the woodlot for wildfire mitigation. And I will just put a plug into, if you know anyone that has mom and pop landscaping businesses, you don't have to buy plastic bags anymore to gather up all your green grass clippings. Just throw them all in a trailer and come scoop it onto our tipping floor, and we will take it and turn it into a soil amendment and benefit the Mat-Su Valley. So this is a look at our landfill gas system. You see in the picture a bunch of horizontal piping with the Arctic pipe, and then all of the horizontal piping goes to and collects and is either pushed or pulled from our landfill gas system, our GCCS gas collection system. It was put together back in the 1980s in partnership with Doyon Utilities. They actually take landfill gas and it is goes through their generators, and then they generate about 7 megawatts, or they can generate about 7 megawatts of power for beneficial use for the military base. So two important components here. One is already existing. You see the flare, that's our main flare on the left-hand side. Now, we do not want to flare our gas. That's the best use. Instead of escaping into the atmosphere, it's better to burn it for the environment. But really what we need to do is try to work on some innovative approaches to beneficial use of the landfill gas, because Doyon can only take so much of our gas. So the picture on the right is what's going to be installed here very soon. That's going to be our leachate evaporator, and that will be powered by landfill gas rather than natural gas. Be one of the applications of many that we will be looking into the future of use of beneficial use. So our landfill gas field, it needs to have certain maintenance and operations, and this is one example of a mitigation effort. If you can imagine a large pile of trash over the years, it tends to settle. And so this is an example of that pipe coming out of the ground. On the right-hand side is a vertical well, and then we connect it to the horizontal piping, and that's how the collection happens in the heap of trash. But sometimes things settle, and then we have to move things around, which is what we did in this picture. We can see from our control system how much is going to the Doyon plant, and then also how much has to be diverted and flared at this point. But again, like I say, one of our priorities is to find more of a beneficial use for the gas. If you look at our 2017 waste composition study, we have a new composition study coming soon. But the bottom line here is that 56.8% of the total organics that comes and is buried into the landfill, that's quite a bit. 56.8% of what's buried in the landfill is organics. So we have an opportunity to divert and use it for beneficial use as well. I love this quote. What we see depends mainly on what we look for. You can call it food scraps, but we're saying you're throwing money away. Again, with the exotic fuel, this is a great resource that can be utilized in many different applications. So looking ahead, just a quick look at that. According to the EPA, there's different really good uses for food recovery hierarchy. A lot of people might think about it as food scraps or leftovers, but we see it as a great resource. So instead of landfilling it or composting it, we really want to try to go up into the triangle, and we're looking at feeding animals as a new pilot program with our food scraps. And then also a little bit about what we heard from before, looking into compressed natural gas can actually power our fleet and potentially the municipality fleet. It works out about a 4-to-1 ratio. So 4 gallons of diesel fuel equals 1 gallon of energy produced by a gallon of equivalent of landfill gas. So that's a really great ratio and savings potential, especially with the price of gas these days, and the importance of doing what we can to utilize the resources that we have instead of depending on regular traditional fuels. We also want to do more to divert to the food forests and curbside and drop off, as well as our vermiculture. And we have several pilot programs working together. So, and I would be remiss also if I didn't mention the waste to energy project that is forthcoming for Anchorage. But that is kind of the, in a nutshell, of how you end up with landfill gas, what we're doing with it now, and how we want to use it in the future. Hopefully I haven't exceeded my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. We're actually doing great on time. And we will have questions to ask you at the end, Q&A at the end. Okay, our next speaker is Greg Dolan. Greg held a variety of senior management positions with the Methanol Institute, serving as CEO for 14 years of his tenure with the Trade Association for the Global Methanol Industry. Upon his retirement in July 2025, Greg formed Pivot Methanol, LLC, providing consulting services to build on a legacy of work supporting the global methanol industry. Please go ahead, Greg.
So thank you for this opportunity. I'm going to talk a little bit about the methanol industry, look at methanol supply and demand. And then I'll talk about two specific markets. That's methanol's use as a marine fuel and also methanol for power generation. But first, a little bit about Pivot Methanol. It's my consulting practice. I formed it in July when I retired from the Methanol Institute after 29 years of service, running the Trade Association for the Global Methanol Industry. And you can see some of the member companies that we represented at the Methanol Institute over those 29 years. With Pivot Methanol, I'm focusing on a couple of areas. I'm helping companies that are developing renewable methanol projects, biomethanol and e-methanol projects around the world, and also looking at specific markets for methanol as an energy resource for maritime, for sustainable aviation fuels, and for power generation. When we look at global methanol demand, it's roughly 94 million metric tons, and methanol, we speak in metric tons as our volume measure. 1 metric ton equals 333 gallons. So global methanol demand of 94 million metric tons is roughly 31 billion gallons. About half of the global market for methanol is its use as a feedstock for chemical production, paints, plastics, solvents, resins, hundreds of products that touch our lives, daily lives. About 35% of methanol demand is for fuels, and that's a direct use of methanol for cars, trucks, buses, industrial boilers, cook stoves, ships, hydrogen carrier for fuel cells. Also derivative products. We just heard from Bob talking about biodiesel, of fatty methyl ester. So methanol is part of biodiesel. And then also MTBE, which is produced in the US largely for an export market. We expect to see methanol demand increase to 131 million metric tons or 43 billion gallons in the next 10 years. And a lot of that increased demand is going to come from shipping. Methanol's use as a bunker fuel. Last year, we had maybe 400,000 tons of methanol that was used as a merchant fuel for ships, and that could grow to 12 million tons in the next 10 years. There are multiple pathways to produce methanol. Most methanol is produced from the steam reformation of natural gas, mature technology, plants that produce 5,000 metric tons per day, 1.8 million metric tons a year, 600 million gallons a year. In the US, we have a lot of methanol production because we have some of the lowest cost natural gas anywhere in the world. We also see methanol produced in China from coal gasification. That's the resource that they have available. And now we're seeing the emergence of renewable methanol. Biomethanol produced from biomass gasification or from biomethane, or e-methanol, which is produced from green hydrogen and CO2. That CO2 can come from biogenic sources, industrial flue gas, or in the future, direct air capture. And there's also low carbon or blue methanol. And there it's a standard methanol plant that's using natural gas as a feedstock, but you're capturing and sequestering the carbon, produce a low carbon blue methanol. In terms of pricing, today, that conventional methanol from natural gas typically trades in a bandwidth between $300 and $400 a ton. Now that we have a conflict in the Middle East, we're seeing spot market pricing for methanol rise dramatically. I have here that methanol spot prices were at $382 a metric ton. To put that in context, for a big chunk of last year was under $300 a ton. But we just saw a trade on Monday that shot up to $450 a metric ton or $1.35 per US gallon. So the impact of the Middle East conflict is being felt across the methanol industry. Low carbon or blue methanol, you add a $50 to $100 premium to gray methanol. Biomethanol trades between $700 and $900, and e-methanol is closer to $1,200 to $2,000 per metric ton. when we look at specifically renewable methanol and low carbon or blue methanol, we have right now about 277 projects that have been announced globally to build methanol production units from low carbon or renewable feedstocks. Now, I say that those 277 projects, if you add up all the announced production capacity, you reach almost 60 million metric tons by 2030, 2031. And again, current methanol demand is 94 million metric tons. Now, we're not going to see all those projects come to fruition. It's easy to put out a press release. It's a bit harder to get off takes, to get feedstocks, to permits, and to actually build a plant. But we're likely to see somewhere between 12 and 14 million tons of methanol, renewable methanol, come onto the market in the next several years. You can see from the map there that these projects are largely clustered in Europe and in China. In Europe, it's being done for regulations. There's a renewable energy directive. There's a fuel EU maritime directive. There's a lot of regulatory push for renewable fuels in the European market. And in China, we're seeing a lot of these projects that are at a purely economic basis. China has some of the lowest cost renewable electricity. They build the turbines, the solar panels. They have low construction costs. We're seeing a lot of renewable methanol projects being announced and built in China. And in the US, we're focusing more on low carbon blue methanol, using our abundant natural gas resources, building new methanol plant, but then capturing the carbon. We can actually capture the carbon dioxide from existing plants as well. So when we look at renewable methanol, e-methanol, and biomethanol, it's a pretty even split between those two different feedstocks, going up to 48 million tons of announced production capacity by 2031. When we add on top of that the low carbon blue methanol, that's when we get up to about 60 million tons. Now, again, where are these projects being built? Largely in China. In the near term, for the next couple of years, the majority of the renewable methanol coming into the marketplace is being built in China. Again, they have some of the lowest cost feedstocks, low cost of construction. They have a real political policy focus on renewable methanol in the Chinese market. We're definitely seeing Europe will be an expanding supplier of renewable methanol. And then again, in North America, it's going to be mostly low carbon blue methanol based on our natural gas resources. If we look at kind of where these projects are, most of them that have been announced are in the early stages. It's kind of pre-feasibility. They're starting to do some of the early engineering. Less projects have actually gotten to construction or even final investment decision. So we're starting to see that momentum, that building where some of these projects are now under construction, operating, or getting to that final investment decision. The market could grow pretty large. This is a slide from Topsoe based on data from McKinsey. They're showing total methanol demand could reach 148 million tons by 2030 and then doubling by 2050, with a lot of that being driven by renewable methanol and for specific markets around aviation, chemicals, and marine fuels. Turning to marine fuels, methanol is going to be an emerging fuel for shipping. It's chemical tankers, it's cruise ships, it's even very large crude carriers, but pilot boats, tugboats, super yachts, cruise ships, heavy lift vessels, crew transfer vessels. Methanol is applicable across the full range of shipping. The big game changer for methanol was from Maersk. When they announced in February of 2021 that the first carbon neutral container ship would be operating on methanol. Now, the Methanol Institute had started working with Maersk in 2019 and introduced them to companies in the methanol value chain, help them understand the benefits of using methanol as a marine fuel. At the IMO in December of 2020, we saw the adoption of guidelines by the International Maritime Organization how to safely manage methanol on board a ship. It was just 3 months later that Maersk made that announcement that the first carbon neutral container ship would be running on methanol. And I was at the naming ceremony for that vessel a little more than 2 years later. The Laura Maersk was that first vessel running on methanol. They now have 19 vessels on the water. Maersk has reported that they're reducing their emissions dramatically running on methanol. They're also, there's reducing their insurance premiums. Methanol is a safer marine fuel than some of the other alternatives, so we're seeing lower emission rates. Now, I would caution that Maersk also reported just 3 weeks ago in their annual report that a lot of the methanol that they're using in those vessels is not renewable methanol. It's conventional methanol from natural gas, as we're seeing the supply of renewable methanol increase in the marketplace. We know that methanol is a mature technology for marine engines. When you're looking at adding methanol, again, it's a liquid fuel. It's wood alcohol. When you're using methanol, you're not changing anything inside the engine. You're changing the fuel injections, the fuel delivery system. So nothing changes inside the engine. It's all external. So it could be both for a solution for retrofits of existing vessels as well as new builds. We've seen a lot of engine sales. MAN, Everlance has sold 300 two-stroke engines. Wärtsilä has sold 300 four-stroke engines in its order book, and we'll hear from Wärtsilä at this seminar tomorrow. WinGD has methanol engines. Caterpillar now is a methanol high-speed engine, and you heard from that earlier today from the work being done with Caterpillar and Oak Ridge National Lab. Cummins is set to follow later this year. So a lot of commercial engines are available for methanol. There's the one picture there of a big engine. It may be hard to see, but then there's one little tiny person standing on a gangway there, just to give you a sense of the scale of how big these engines are. They're just massive. And like one of those big two-stroke engines, that ship will consume somewhere around 40 to 60,000 metric tons of methanol per year, one ship. So they need a lot of fuel. In terms of what's on the water and what's in the order book, we've got 108 vessels that are on the water today running on methanol. A lot of them are chemical tankers, where you're literally taking methanol from the storage tank, the cargo tank, putting onto a service tank on the top of the vessel and then into the engine room. So they're burning their own cargo. Now, again, we're seeing cruise ships, we're seeing container ships, a lot more ships that are running on methanol. And the order book is up to 431 vessels that have been ordered to run on methanol. And to put that into perspective, that's, we're talking about like tens of billions of dollars of investment in methanol vessels by these shipping companies. There are also, let's see. There's also methanol-ready vessels. So there in the shipyard, you've made some modifications to the vessel that in the future, you could bring it back and run it and change it to run on methanol. And there's about 300 of those vessels on the water and another 1,000 in the order books. You can also retrofit existing vessels to run on methanol. Now, if we take a look over time, the cumulative number of these vessels we expect could reach as many as 660 methanol vessels on the water by 2030. Now, the International Maritime Organization, when it's postponed adoption of its net zero framework, that took some of the wind out of the sails of using alternative fuels in the shipping segment. But even after that decision last October, we're continuing to see vessel operators order more ships running on methanol and LNG and other alternative fuels. If we look at take that number of vessels we're going to see on the water up to 660 by 2030, the total cumulative demand for methanol could reach 20 million tons by 2030, according to Jena Solutions. And a Bloomberg study found that right at about 19 million tons of potential methanol demand for shipping. So we're going to need a lot more methanol, and maybe we can make some of it in Alaska. Methanol, again, it's a liquid fuel, wood alcohol, so it's easy to bunker. You can use a lot of the existing diesel infrastructure for methanol bunkering. Methanol is one of the most widely traded chemical commodities in the world. 200 of the world's largest ports already have storage tanks of methanol within their port complex. So it's literally getting that last half mile from the storage tank to bunker the ship onto a vessel. We have now, that's a little bit old, there's about 20 ports now that have methanol bunkering capability, and another 40 are developing that. And we also know how to safely bunker methanol on a ship. It can be done ship to ship with bunker barges, could be shore to ship, anchor truck on shore to ship. So there's a lot of ways of bunkering methanol. We have a lot of safe handling guidelines that have already been adopted by international bodies as well as individual ports. So the bunkering is straightforward for methanol as a liquid fuel. One of the big things that we're seeing in shipping is green corridors, which is kind of linking up ports that are promoting alternative fuels and making sure that they have the infrastructure and the fuel ready to support the ships that are going to be running on these different fuels. One of the key green corridors of shipping is the Pacific Northwest to Alaska Green Corridor. There, it's a focus on cruise ships running between Seattle, Vancouver, and Anchorage, running on methanol. And we expect to have, I think the plan is for like 5 cruise ships by 2030 running that route on methanol fuel. Related to this, and turning to power generation, a lot of ports are now being required to offer shoreside power. When you pull your vessel up to a port, you want to be able to plug it in so you can turn off the big engines and not pollute. Methanol can also be a solution there. We can take what are diesel engines and run them on methanol. We can take turbines and run them on methanol. So the concept here is a power barge where the barge holds the methanol. You put an engine on top that creates electricity, and that is what you plug into a ship when it's at port. So shoreside power through powered barges or stationary power as well. One of the leading methanol producers and distributors, Promon, the second largest methanol producer and distributor, formed a spin-off company, Power 32, specifically to look at these markets for power generation. And it's not just that shoreside power, but also data centers. And anything, and certainly in Alaska, there's a big focus on diesel gen sets. A lot of Wärtsilä engines running on diesel, heavy fuel oil. They could all be running on methanol with dramatically reduced emissions. Siemens Energy, 3 years ago now, converted a 15 megawatt turbine to run on methanol. Took them all 2 weeks to do the conversion. They were able to cold start on methanol. So again, turbines could be another opportunity for methanol. Siemens now can offer a methanol fueled turbine anywhere from 5 to 90 megawatts for power generation. And I mentioned data centers. Where I'm sitting in Northern Virginia, I can drive just a couple miles away and I'm in the middle of Data Center Alley, the largest grouping of data centers anywhere in the world. Next to every one of those big white boxes of data centers is banks of diesel gen sets. There are, 24, 2.5, 3 megawatt gen sets running on diesel for standby backup power. The engine manufacturers that build those are the same ones that are building these marine engines running on methanol. So we can use methanol in those data centers for standby backup power as well as primary power. And the last piece I'll mention is methanol is an excellent hydrogen carrier fuel. Methanol is CH3OH. It packs a lot of hydrogen. There are no carbon-to-carbon bonds, so it readily releases its hydrogen. So it's a great liquid hydrogen carrier fuel, and it's not cryogenic. It's a hydrogen carrier fuel at room temperature and pressure. And there are a lot of applications for methanol as a hydrogen carrier for fuel cell. Methanol also has a very, very low freezing point. So if you're looking at real cold environments and you need fuel cells, methanol is your hydrogen source. And with that, I have just my contact information for Pivot Methanol. And I thank you for your attention. Looking forward to the questions and the discussion.
Thank you, Greg. That was great. Very interesting. So our next speaker is actually a good segue from Greg's presentation. J.R. Wilcox is the founder and CEO of Aliaschem. He was born in Fairbanks and holds a BS in chemistry and an MS in environmental chemistry from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. He has created a series of successful companies culminating in Aliaschem. Please go ahead, JR.
All right. Hey, thank you very much. And I'm got to say, I'm really enjoying this this conference so far. This has been great. Thank you to everybody, and I've enjoyed every presentation. And I think I'll keep my presentation fairly short. I'm really looking forward. Greg's obviously a preeminent speaker on the subject of methanol. So I'll try and keep this to what Alieskim's doing, some notes about the Alaska context, and look forward to the conversation. So yeah, I'm the founder CEO of Alieskim. We're developing a plant on the North Slope, which is under building modules off-site now, and should be next month starting putting the pilings in for the foundation. So the next couple of years are construction, and then we'll be shipping product here towards the end of 2027. So this is not a theoretical thing that we're talking about here. We do have this methanol plant, which will also be creating hydrogen. We're using the hydrogen in order to clean up the North Slope diesel that can be made up there in the topping units to remove the sulfur so that it can be used in engines. So methanol and ultra low sulfur diesel are the two top things that are currently brought into the North Slope. So this is a big step towards Alaska becoming self-sufficient, and the North Slope being self-sufficient on some of its key commodities. I should note that we've been talking about methanol as a fuel. We are not. The current market is not methanol as fuel. It is methanol as freeze protection. Methanol, of course, as Greg said, is extremely versatile. It's used in a lot of applications, but it's kind of through this process of developing methanol that at least I became aware of its potential in energy applications. So currently, Alieskim, we're building a site in Central Prudhoe Bay. We have our gas supply contracts, done. The pipeline's done. The site's built. Other key contracts and permits are in place. Module fabrication is underway, and groundbreaking is next month. First production by the end of 2027. This is what the current methanol supply chain for Alaska looks like. And we've been supplying methanol to the North Slope since the very beginning. So this is almost like 50 years now. We've been taking methanol. Most of it's come from Trinidad, Brunei, other places overseas. So you're taking the simplest molecule that you can make out of natural gas and bringing it in thousands and thousands of miles to a place with stranded natural gas. And that is how we've been doing things until, and continue to, but soon we'll be replacing that with using North Slope natural gas in order to make the methanol. And yeah, similar story for diesel. That doesn't have to come quite as far. Here's our aerial image of our production site. So just for a little context, that this is the smack in the middle of Prudhoe Bay. We're close to pump station 1 where Trans-Alaska Pipeline starts. That's flow station number 3 to the north. There's about a 1,000-foot line shown. This Google Earth image was taken before the Harvest LNG plant was built on the west portion of the pad. That is up and running and providing LNG to be trucked to Fairbanks currently. We're going to be using the same pipeline off the main Prudhoe Bay field fuel gas line. It's going to come into our plant where we're going to go and turn it into methanol and hydrogen. This is going to be the only reformer for thousands of miles in any direction that's active. Then we've got 7 billion cubic feet a day of gas, mostly just moving around in a circle. It comes out of the wells and it's re-injected to the subsurface. And so we're going to be taking a little bit of that and creating something with it. Okay, let's see here. So this slide I might take a little time on because the panel really is alternative fuel production. And one of the remarkable things about methanol is its versatility in applications and its versatility in the ways it can be produced. And I think that makes it especially relevant as we start having these sustainable energy discussions, because your ideal alternative fuels are things which can be additive to the energy mix today, that make economic sense today, that can benefit the consumer today and are scalable to where they can make a global impact and be still, used and long term. And so when we're talking about methanol, of course, I've talked about its use as freeze protection in the North Slope. It's one of these things that it blends with oil, it blends with water, it goes down to an insanely cold temperature and remains a liquid. So it's very, very useful in Alaska for energy industry and industrial operations. Globally, as Greg showed, it's foundational for building consumer products, construction industry, methanol to fuels. So China, really from a national security standpoint, I think got to this place where they were able to take coal, turn it into methanol, and turn the methanol into olefins. And so they're creating direct crude oil substitutions through chemistry that help make them more energy independent. Then even when we talk about energy, it's really even more versatile than we see hydrocarbons, because you can use it in a fuel cell, you can use it in a turbine, you can burn it in a compression engine, you can burn it in a spark ignition engine. There's a lot of different ways that you can then, once you have the methanol, that you can turn it into the kind of power that people want, especially for mobile applications. It burns in heaters. The space heat's one of these things that I think is really ripe for alternative fuel use. So these are just fundamental chemical reactions. I won't get down into this too much, but a few things I just want to point out. You can make methanol from methane and water. So that's classic steam methane reforming. And that's how most of the basic workhorse of the chemical industry today, and methanol specifically. So that's not green methanol, blue methanol. That is just how you make it. Now, you can introduce carbon dioxide into that mixture, and it actually can work great up to 10%, 20%, quarter percent of your feedstock can be replaced with CO2 with very little change. So that's what we're doing at Aliescum, is sort of that second step where we're cutting CO2 into our natural gas and using that to help us make the methanol. And you can see the and methanol is exothermic. So usually when you're creating it from natural gas, it's releasing heat. When you're bringing in a quarter of your feedstock as CO2, it's still releasing heat. Just you're not losing quite as much, and you're actually destroying CO2. You're taking it and making it into something that's not CO2. There are e-methanol and green methanol are two technologies which are start with CO2. E-methanol, you'll see, takes a lot of power, so you have to assume that you're getting cheap clean power from somewhere else. But if you've got cheap clean power and CO2, then you can make a carbon neutral fuel. And then green methanol, that's where you have hydrogen, and you can take that hydrogen and CO2, and at a much lower energy cost, you can turn that into methanol. So where we get hydrogen from is another question. The geologic hydrogen is one of these areas I'm very interested in how that develops. There's also electrolyzers. There's lots of different ways to make hydrogen. If you can have hydrogen is much harder to move around than methanol, and that matters for not just long range transportation of the energy to a site. Also, for if you have a car, if you have a plane, if you have some sort of mobile application, it's much easier to have that in the form of a liquid. So we've heard a bit about methanol engines. I'm not an expert on the subject, so I'll go over them briefly, but I think it's hard to talk about methanol as a fuel without talking about its potential in engines. As Greg said, this is becoming common now in marine applications. Oak Ridge, as you saw, is working with Caterpillar. Other engine manufacturers are really looking at how to make dual fuel engines, methanol fueled engines. They can, we use it as racing fuel in Formula One. So, I mean, it's a high performance fuel. It's unlike many things, it's actually economically competitive with hydrocarbon fuels now. If we're looking at this sort of from the frame of reference that we heard from Mike at DOE today, this is an additive thing that we can do to the energy mixture that takes natural gas and other resources that aren't really being able to be fully utilized in the mobile applications today and allows us to use it. The spill impacts are reduced. We saw that also with Oak Ridge. If we were to deal with a shipping corridor opening up in the Arctic Ocean, and we had conventional shipping fuel spilled in broken ice conditions, it would be very difficult to clean up. If this is a ship that's running on methanol, however, the methanol mixes into the water and disperses. So it's a big environmental advantage for that way. Emissions, we don't, if we're making methanol from fossil sources, your life cycle emissions are, they'll probably improve a little bit, but it's not going to be necessarily dramatic when you look at CO2. But the other emissions like particulate matter goes to, basically zero. Your carbon monoxide goes far down, your sulfur oxides basically disappeared. And NOx is usually reduced, sometimes quite a lot. That depends on engine design. But one of the things I want to call out from an Arctic viewpoint and a climate viewpoint is that I think that the impact of black carbon frequently gets underappreciated. We tend to focus a lot on CO2, but when we're talking about the creation of black particulate matter, which is what soot is, and it settles on a white thing like ice or a glacier, it significantly changes the rate at which that ice is able to absorb sunlight. So eliminating soot is actually a big environmental and a big climate win, and that's one of those things that burning methanol lets you do. And closing, this is a graphic of what the plant is going to look like once it's finished. So that's fun. You can see Flow 3 in the background, and that's the plan. So anyway, thanks everybody for your time, and happy to take any questions when we get to question 30 here.
Thank you, JR. That was great, and I look forward to questions on that topic. Our next speaker is Laurent Nassif. He has more than 2 decades in the energy industry and holds a PhD in chemical engineering from Georgia Tech and executive MBA from Northwestern. Laurent is the CEO of Sustainable Solutions and AI Venture Foundry, developing local projects and startups in North America.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Aloha to everyone. Aloha to Bob too. I don't know if you can see me from your window, but I'm also located in Hawaii. And today I'm going to talk about ammonia and ammonia solutions for Alaska. So I think this is the last remaining of those liquid fuels that haven't been touched upon too much, at least in this session. So what is ammonia? Before I go into the presentation, really what I wanted to do is just mention that my background is really into project and portfolio management. I'm the only level A assessor in the US for the IPMA. So I do see things through the lens of operating assets or fully developed projects, and is it implementable, and what are the economics of those solutions. So I just want to mention that there's going to be some economics a little bit in there, so you're aware of that. So today I'm going to talk about ammonia, which is NH3, so 1 nitrogen, 3 hydrogen. As Greg mentioned earlier, it's one of the hydrogen carriers. Other main hydrogen carriers are methanol, so CO carrying 3 hydrogen, and CH4, 1 carbon for 4 hydrogen. What's good with ammonia, is that it's a multi-purpose product. So it's used a lot, obviously, as a fertilizer. The nitrogen helps plant grow. It's also used as a chemical. and now it's more and more used or looked at to be used as a way to store energy, transport energy, and produce energy. It has a high energy per volume, like all other liquid fuels, mostly because of the liquid state. It is about half the BTU content of methanol. And the reason for that is that it doesn't have carbon in its molecule. So it doesn't produce CO2 greenhouse gas during combustion. But the drawback is obviously you're losing some on the energy content. The only greenhouse gas really that could come out is the NOx. But again, we saw that earlier in this virtual workshop. There are solutions, to capture the NOxes. It's used generally for large-scale operations and production. Pipeline and marine transport is more and more looked into because of the fact it's a liquid fuel that has multi-purpose. And it has synergies with methanol, which I'm going to go into more detail later on in one of the future slides. It's really good because we generally need energy for storage, but ammonia can be stored at ambient condition with water. I always have to be careful when I say ambient condition because ambient condition is maybe different from Alaska compared to Hawaii or other places. But the fact that we are in Alaska is actually a benefit, with respect to storage. So again, energy storage, transport, firm energy, firm power, they're all applications for ammonia. Before I go into what is on the right, which is why ammonia, I have to really mention that I'm focusing in these slides on renewable sourced ammonia and product. The reason why I'm doing that is renewable literally means non-depletable. So that's one of the key elements that we're looking into. And also the sourcing matters, especially local sourcing, because that really influences affordability and also influence the reliability of the product and the supply chain. So why ammonia? Well, fossil fuels are depletable, right, by definition. And they're often subject to market and supply chain volatility because they're indexed. So you want to have something that is not depletable so you don't run out of it, in the short term, mid-term, or long term. And the more it's produced locally, the least it's going to be dependent on supply chain disruptions, which we're experiencing right now, and the variation in the price of the product. We have a lot of resources, renewable resources in Alaska. Actually, this is maybe the state that has the most renewable resources in the US. But a lot of them are variable. So to firm up those renewable sources, you need a way to store the energy efficiently and to transport it efficiently. And that's where liquid fuels really play a big role. And of course, the gas grids, the power grids, all need capacity and storage management. And as I mentioned, communities need cost-effective, reliable, environmentally sustainable energy. So liquid fuels like ammonia, which are multi-purpose and allow us to leverage existing infrastructure, are really good solutions for these issues. So how does it fit in the hydrogen pathways? So basically, it's that blue rectangle on the screen. So hydrogen can be generated from multiple ways. The main ones are an electrolyzer, which breaks down the water molecules into hydrogen and oxygen. Another one is gasification. It's basically waste to hydrogen or waste to energy. And I would love to talk to Kelly about that as well. I always love a nice trash talk. And it's basically breaking down of the trash, municipal solid waste into its elements. And then reformer, especially steam reforming, which is breaking down of the hydrocarbon chains into carbon and hydrogen. So ammonia and methanol, for that matters, are just one more step after that. It's basically a combination of the hydrogen with, in the case of ammonia, nitrogen that comes from the air separation unit, or for ammonia, as JR just mentioned, you can basically capture the carbon oxides with the hydrogen and produce your methanol. Okay, so typically ammonia has been produced in a very large scale. So they're very large projects, and it's a very well understood technology in multiple assets all around the world. These slides come from one of the projects that I was working on, and because of the fluctuations and the dependence on supply chains, the product itself, the price, kept on varying. So one way to mitigate that, especially at large scale, was to combine ammonia and methanol production. So having two products means having two potential offtakes and multiple usage. And so that was the strategy there. And that's what I really wanted to mention here. Someone earlier in the virtual workshop said, hey, like they're all good solutions. All of the above is what works. I will go even further than that. I think what is the most efficient from a commercial standpoint is to basically do those collaborations and these co-productions. So the idea behind the co-production between ammonia and methanol is that in this case, I'm looking at steam reforming. You're producing some carbon oxides by breaking down the carbohydrates bonds, and you can capture these carbons into the production of methanol. So that's what would make that project at large scale more attractive. Now, as it relates to ammonia in the world, this is a screen capture from one of the virtual maps that I created. I'm gonna put a bunch in the internet on my website in the next few weeks. But this shows basically where the major ammonia facilities are located in the world. So we can see the Middle East obviously has some very large ones. Europe has some, Australia has some, Canada, mostly Alberta, has some, and then in the US, the Louisiana, Texas area is where the major ammonia facilities are. Those are all the largest ones. And the big producers include also China. And the big demand comes from India, Japan, Asia in general, and also North America. So that's looking at it from a macro level. And it's really saying, hey, ammonia has been produced for a long time. It's a very mature technology. Now, I think Greg was the one that was mentioning that the most. There's really two ways with the production of ammonia and methanol as well, right? So historically, we've been looking at very large projects, steam reforming, stream methane reforming, or steam reforming to generate ammonia. But more and more, we're realizing, hey, ammonia is a hydrogen carrier, and therefore it's only one step additional to the production of hydrogen. So it's really, there is a big push now from multiple providers to get a modular ammonia synthesis facilities that can work at a smaller scale and can be just basically plugged into the typical ways of producing hydrogen. So the three main ways of producing hydrogen are electrolysis, gasification, and reforming of natural gas, renewable liquid natural gas. So electrolysis, I put there an actual project that has feedstock, that has offtake, just to give you a notion of what the economics of a project would look like for this type of production, which is 3 million terms per year. Then next to that is an actual project, again, for gasification that use any kind of waste to produce renewable natural gas. This is one module. All of these are basically looking at modular technologies. And it's cheaper, the gasification, compared to electrolysis. Again, it will depend on the conditions, and we'll talk more about that tomorrow. But there is an influence of scale in those economics. And then the last one is doing a small scale reforming. And this is looking at a 3 million terms. So that can be achieved locally by producing renewable natural gas locally, or if we need something to be provided really quickly, basically importing renewable liquid natural gas in ISO containers, from Canada, for instance. But anyway, a big push industrially for a different way of producing ammonia, which is adding those modular ammonia synthesis to those other modular hydrogen production. The image on the top right side is an image of the Agrium site. So I just wanted to mention that Alaska has a history of producing ammonia, and having already infrastructures for transport, for storage, or even some of the equipment in place is one way of reducing the cost for ammonia production, local ammonia production, especially for those larger projects. So, okay, that's all I had for ammonia. The key lesson learned really is that Alaska has ideal condition for various hydrogen solutions and ammonia solutions, and it has a history with respect to producing ammonia. Ammonia production can be supplemental to hydrogen. It's supplemental to methanol, and I think this is what we need to take out from those conversations, is that it's not one type of fuel versus another type of fuel. It's really they're all needed, and where the real value lies is in the collaborations and the co-productions between the different fuels. Having that kind of like flexibility and thinking about it in that way is what will help us finding solutions for Alaska. And again, Alaska has sites and history with respect to some of those fuel production, and I think leveraging those for more production of alternative fuel is what we're looking into. The last thing I want to finish is local is the most critical part of all of those projects, because local means more reliable, it means more affordable, and it means also supporting the local economy. But what comes with that is the need to build local capacity to be able to bring those projects to fruition and to be able to operate those assets. So there we go. That's what I had. So I'm open for any questions if you have any.
Great. Thank you very much, Laurent. We have some questions in the chat, and I'm going to give everybody a chance to add any questions they may have while I ask a few upfront questions. Looks like we've got our speakers lined up. My first question is for Kelly. How long will the landfill produce gas if you pivot away from burying trash in 5 years? And I believe this question is related to the plan for a waste to energy power generation plant.
Well, thank you for the question. It's really interesting when you look at the projected curve, gas curve production for what was originally anticipated for the landfill. We've far exceeded what those original projections were in terms of production, which means we didn't exactly get it right at the very beginning, but we were the first large landfill in Alaska to do what we're doing today. So it's a little bit of an unknown, but what is known is that after the last piece of trash, so after a 5-year cell, after waste is placed in a certain spot in the landfill, after 5 years, that's when it goes into that anaerobic state and starts developing the landfill gas. So that is when we put the wells in, and that's when we start collecting the gas from that cell. Once the very last piece of trash is finally placed in the landfill, whenever that actually happens, then it peaks its production at 10 years past the landfill, 10 years after the last piece of trash was placed. So in theory, 10 years after the landfill is capped, then that will be, in theory, peak production. And I say in theory because we have an historic landfill here in Anchorage that was closed in the 1980s, and it's still producing gas, quite a bit of gas. So I'm a little bit hesitant other than to just say that we far exceeded what those original expectations were. So I think we've got at least 10 years before the peak after it's closed. And then it will continue to make gas from there. Hope that's helpful.
Yes, thank you, Kelly. Another question. So this is a question for Greg. Climate change and diminishing sea ice have led to an increase in Arctic shipping. The International Maritime Organization has banned the use of heavy fuel oil on ships operating in Arctic waters for protection from oil spills and to reduce emissions of black carbon. Is methanol potentially a better fuel for Arctic shipping?
Yeah, thanks, David. And JR certainly touched on this in his discussion too. Methanol is wood alcohol, so it's a liquid at ambient temperature and pressure. If there was a spill in an ocean environment, the first thing you have is dilution, right? Methanol will mix completely miscible in water, so it will be diluted. It'll be the wave action. Methanol is also biodegradable in aerobic and anaerobic environments. So even if it makes it down in the sea floor, it won't persist. When we look at the kind of impacts on a spill for marine life, one measure is LC50. So that means how much of a product spill is going to kill half the fish population, a lethal dose 50. So for methanol, it's 15,400 milligrams per liter, which is 200 times that of diesel fuel. So it's much more environmentally benign, less harmful for fish if there's a spill. Laurent was talking about ammonia, and the LC50 for ammonia is 0.0069. So you have to be very careful of ammonia in a marine environment and not having spills. JR also touched on the black carbon. So, we talk about methanol burns with an invisible flame. Well, that can be a good thing. It burns with an invisible flame because there are no carbon to carbon bonds, and that's what creates particulate matter or soot. So if you're burning methanol, you're not creating particulate matter or soot. In fact, in a methanol engine for a ship, the only particulate matter you're going to get is from the diesel fuel that's used as a ignition improver, and also from any lubricants. But other than that, you're going to see like a 95% reduction in particulate matter. So, combine safety for the sea if there's a spill and reduction of particulate matter makes methanol a really ideal marine fuel for Arctic environments.
Great. Thank you, Greg. And then here's one for JR. Could you talk about the regulatory obstacles to broader adoption of methanol engines?
Oh, that could be its own panel, but it's one thing that we kind of were trying to do a few years ago was bring in some of these engines that you can buy in, out of Scandinavia or China, and see if because methanol is commercially attractive and environmentally attractive fuel for in some parts of Alaska now. And what we found is that the EPA really has this certification process for engines that is really going to be a problem for any large scale use of alternative fuels if they're like biodiesel, or things that already meet the definition of diesel or gasoline, no matter where they're sourced for, they're that's fine. But if you start bringing in methanol, ammonia, hydrogen, anything different, even if it works in an engine that's already approved to operate on gasoline and diesel, it's a very, very long and very expensive process, and it has to be redone for each individual engine. So what it does is create a very expensive and long technical challenge for any engine manufacturer to get into the U.S. market, which effectively has, I think, blocks a lot of the use in particularly transportation or mobile sources, and that's something that we're probably going to have to deal with in a regulatory issue some way to sort of a more broad. Hey, look, we tested it. It improved emissions. It was fine for engine life. Let's approve it across a larger category instead of waiting for each individual manufacturer to test it for years and years and years to show that, yes, here's how it reacts over the time that we operate the engine, and then do it over again for each individual engine. We need to figure out a way to get away from that.
Well, that discussion hits particularly close to home for me because I spent 4 years working with EPA to change the requirement for Tier 4 diesels in rural Alaska to Tier 3. So it's possible, but took a long time. Okay, I'm going to move to the questions in the chat, and please do continue to add them. We've got about 9 or 10 more minutes. So here's one. What is your typical conversion ratio with distillation? There must be some loss. And I'll open this to the group to see if anybody wants to take that.
I think that was specifically for Bob.
Okay, I was wondering if that was for biodiesel. So for distilling biodiesel, we lose about 4%, and we use that 4% that we pull off to run our boilers for heat for the process. So it's not actually lost, and that's all we pull off of there. So the whole process from a gallon of vegetable oil to a gallon of distilled biodiesel is about 93% is the finished product.
Okay, thank you, Bob. Here's another one. DLA has an RFI out for 53 million gallons. Can you take pollock bycatch that is now thrown overboard by factory trawlers and turn it into diesel fuel for CDQ member villages? Very specific question.
I guess that's for on the biodiesel side. The path is to take fish waste and render it. You heat it up and break the cell wall. The oil floats off. All that oil can be made into biodiesel at about like I said, about a 93% conversion ratio. Maybe the others can, if there's the other process to use fish waste would be to try to digest it and, do an anaerobic digestion to make gas out of it. But it's already a pretty spectacular molecule. Fish oil is is basically so close to becoming diesel fuel. You hate to break it further than that. Let's let the fish do the hard work and making that oil.
Yeah, I was gonna mention we actually with ASAP had put together um, a proposal which ultimately didn't end up being submitted, but where we could easily actually do that with modular technology. And as Bob just mentioned, fish waste is already an ideal feedstock for production of liquid fuels. So there is definitely a way to do that extremely efficiently. And if that is of interest, for sure, we have already put together, what the project would look like for that. I think it's just it's an ideal situation. Just waste in general is, in my view, the best feedstock, and so this entire process will be beneficial, a win-win-win for everyone.
I'd like to add to that too is, when we started 30 years ago, and the oils that we had to use had to be fairly good quality to make biodiesel. But we've advanced the process now where we're using all the way down to trap grease and getting that into this highly refined biodiesel. So the fish waste doesn't have to be prime. It could be fairly, pretty bad. and any waste that comes off of, headworks grease off of wastewater treatment plants, there's a lot of oils out there. It does have to be a triglyceride of some sort, a plant or animal fat, and that's any grade of degradation today we can make into highly refined biodiesel.
Yeah, and you can make methanol as well too from that, which has a nice story, right? Because you're using fishing, boat, type of waste, and then you're bringing that back to the fishing boats, right? Through fuel, right? So it's a very nice story in that sense, a nice circular economy.
Thank you. And 25 years ago, the state did some research on fish oil, and one of the conclusions was that it works, but it's more valuable for as a nutrition supplement and also for cosmetic applications. I don't know if that's still true today. So here's a question for Kelly. Are there waste stream materials which cause the most problems for landfill gas generation?
Ooh, waste streams that cause problems?
Yes.
I don't know. I don't know that answer. I've never been asked that question before, so I don't really know. I'd have to think about that one for a little bit.
Okay, well, here's another one while you're thinking about that one. What level of pre-treatment of the landfill gas is needed before running it in the engines?
So that's a really great question on pre-treatment. We have we've actually encountered an increase in the siloxanes, which are a contaminant in our landfill gas, and so as we move forward, we are actually looking into installing scrubbers to clean the gas prior to sending it to Doyon, because it does gum up their engines quite a bit. So it's kind of like, when we eat fat and it clogs up our arteries, it's similar. And so the siloxane starts to get crusty on the inside, and then they have to pull those engines apart and clean them often. So because of that, we are looking into the investment of scrubbers, which will position SWS in a way that we can utilize cleaner gas for beneficial use, and we'll be more well positioned for that in the future.
I think you answered both questions, Kelly. Thank
Perfect.
you. So here's maybe the last question because we're running out of time, but what challenges do the speakers foresee regarding fuel storage for these materials? Considerations may include minus 40-degree temperatures, higher tank volume needs for meeting energy density equivalents, and the challenges of any pressurized storage needs.
I can jump in for just a second on that one. I mean, at least in terms of methanol, it's one of the big advantages of methanol is that it can stay stable at cold temperatures for a very long time, which is, I think, an exciting application for Alaska because if you say have a tank of backup fuel and you don't really use it very often, as long as it stays dry in the tank, you don't wind up with it gelling like diesel in extreme cold. It does not have any kind of a pressurized vessel. It's the same kind of tank that you would store gasoline or diesel in. And you're correct to note that the energy density is the problem and that you need twice as much storage per energy unit.
Great. Thank you, JR. Good question, good answer. Fuel storage is near and dear to my heart. So that was a lot of my career. Mari, are you ready to step in?
I'm ready. I almost forgot I still had a job to do. I was just enjoying listening to the talks. That was a great panel. Thank you all very much. Okay, so now we're going to move to our last session of the day, and this will be a presentation by Hunter Mack on low temperature combustion of ammonia and hydrogen. Professor Mack joined the Department of Mechanical and Industrial Engineering at the University of Massachusetts Lowell in 2014. His research focuses on overcoming the scientific and technical barriers shaping the future of energy and transportation. So we are really glad to have you here today, Hunter, and you can take it away.
All right, glad to be here. Thank you very much. So thank you all for sticking around today. And I know that I am the last person between you and lunch if you're in Alaska and you and going home if you're on the East Coast like me. As Mari mentions, my name is Hunter Mack. I'm at the University of Massachusetts Lowell, which is outside of Boston. We're a large engineering school that has kind of a long history in energy engineering, which is how I ended up at this university. And I want to talk today about some relatively new experiments, and a new interest area for us is looking at ammonia, hydrogen, and other fuels at very low temperatures. And a little bit of background on why we are interested in this is over the last few years, we have kind of instituted a new realm of research for us at UMass Lowell in conjunction with some partners at Stony Brook University under the guidance of the Office of Naval Research. And so this large, it's a relatively large consortium in terms of number of projects, but 2 universities, some commercial partners are looking at energy resilience from as a broad definition. So we're looking at everything from grids and microgrids to energy storage, and then kind of the power generation side, which is historically where I have worked, especially when it comes to propulsion systems. And so it was posed to us that some traditional fuels, which are used in low temperature regimes, and when I say low, as a combustion scientist, low temperature means a lot. You guys saw a great talk by Jim Zybist earlier. Low temperature combustion means something different if you're at one of my combustion conferences. But here, if I say low temperature, that means sub-zero, so very cold. Traditional hydrocarbon fuels face a number of problems when you get down to sub-zero temperatures, including poor vaporization, increased viscosity, fuel gelling, wax formation, decreased chemical reactivity, and a number of other issues, one of which that is being key is higher required ignition energies. So simply going down to lower temperatures brings in a host of problems that we need to be able to overcome from a technical perspective. These challenges can result in issues at cold conditions, which can result in loss in operation, misfire, increased emissions, decreased efficiency, and a variety of problems which could be deemed undesirable by the end user, no matter where it's at. So obviously, we're looking at Arctic conditions up into aerospace conditions, and this was deemed necessary by the Navy. And so we've kind of started pushing ahead based on some of our prior work on ammonia. Ammonia was kind of determined to be a nice starting point for where we might be able to learn a little bit more about these sub-zero conditions. Now, where do ammonia and hydrogen fit in, and why might we need to be able to do specific experiments and do specific studies related to these sub-zero temperatures. Well, this is kind of great that we're coming last because we've talked a lot about production and properties of all these various alternative fuels. Hydrogen and ammonia have been talked about at length, but I want to kind of call out a couple of the specific ones. One of which being the laminar burning velocity, which is kind of a canonical measure of how fast a fuel burns, and that time scale of how fast something burns dictates how we might be able to use it in a particular application, say a reciprocating engine or a gas turbine, right? And so specific fuels may have a broad range of laminar burning velocities. For example, you're around 300 centimeters per second for hydrogen at ambient conditions and about 7 centimeters per second for ammonia. So that's very, very different behavior. And I've got methane on this slide as well, just kind of as a reference point for a fuel that we're very familiar with, since methane is the primary component of natural gas. And so this change in laminar burning velocity, which would change how we design systems that use primarily ammonia conditions. However, there are a lot of issues if you want to run pure ammonia, some of which have been talked about today, but one of which being the ignition energy, which is going to be a second phase of this project. I'm not going to talk as much about it today, but I'll focus a little bit on the laminar burning velocity issues. But in addition to all these benefits from a production standpoint and then the displacement standpoint that we've talked about in the workshop today, there's some technical hurdles to the use. Not everything is a drop-in fuel, and there's definitely other things outside of the pure combustion aspect that we need to consider, and then we'll discuss those a little bit at the very end. Now, I talked a little bit about how we have all these challenges at sub-zero temperatures and this increasing interest in ammonia and hydrogen as non-carbon fuels or in the low-carbon fuel category. But there are particular advantages that might be available at very low temperatures. One of which, from a generation standpoint, is that to make ammonia, you need hydrogen. Hydrogen often produced by electrolysis of water. That process is actually aided at very low temperatures because you have better thermal management and some reduced losses during the process. Also, at these temperatures, if you're talking about a large industrial process, not having to worry about gelling or phase separation problems might make things easier. From a storage standpoint, ammonia is naturally suited to these cold environments and can be stored at a liquid at moderate pressures at these sub-zero temperatures. So, they provide some advantages over hydrogen, which oftentimes, if you want to get to high energy densities by a volumetric basis, you have to store at very high pressures, which brings in other issues, some of which maybe some folks are concerned about safety at those pressures, but also cost associated with that high pressure vessels. And then from a system level advantage, highly compatible, the production of ammonia is highly compatible with electrified energy systems. And furthermore, if you're talking about excess energy, there's a lot of interest in the Department of Defense about running micro-nuclear or smaller nuclear reactors, which you have a lot of excess electricity during non-peak hours because you're not going to turn those systems off. You also have a lot of waste heat, which can be utilized in these processes. So there may be some kind of symbiotic relationships for the production of hydrogen and ammonia as energy storage for then later deployment for either in power generation or in transportation scenario. So you can start to see how this kind of larger viewpoint, I'm kind of zooming out, this larger viewpoint where ammonia and hydrogen might play a role before we start digging into kind of some of the things that we've seen. We start doing some of our kind of fundamental university type experiments. And as I mentioned earlier, we've got a lot of experience in my laboratory working with ammonia hydrogen blends and studying their kind of basic combustion properties. And the reason I kind of emphasize basic is we do a lot of our experiments in something that is called a constant volume combustion chamber, or CVCC, which is a canonical experiment which allows us to ignite a fuel air mixture in a small volume, constant volume. Ours is almost 2 liters. We usually centrally ignite it with electrodes, and therefore we can observe a spherically expanding flame, which reduces down to kind of a single dimension in the radius. So we can back out a lot of fundamental flame properties. We can also sample the exhaust gases produced by this combustion process, and we can look how different fuels, different fuel blends, different working fluids, different oxidizer ratios affect our emissions. And we've done work for the last 10 years in this across a wide range of fuels, including ammonia. I discussed the fact that we want to watch these flames. The way we do that is through large quartz windows. which are located on either side of this constant volume combustion chamber. And we do our visualization using something called Schlieren imaging. And the reason I wanted to discuss this is I'm going to show a little bit of results, but then we're going to kind of move into a different vessel we've designed for this for these particular tests. This imaging, some example images here for those of you who aren't familiar with Schlieren imaging. It's a unique way of being able to take a picture of a flame front. I'm using picture in just kind of a generic term because typically when we take pictures, we look at densities or differences in light, right? Whereas Schlieren captures differences in density. And a flame is quite hot, so therefore it has a much different density than its burned or its unburned gases. And so we can actually visualize that flame front. On the left, you have a animation that is a slowed down version of a methane flame that was taken at 8,000 frames per second. And then I kind of have still images of two different fuels, one of which is hydrogen and ammonia on the center, and the other one which is hydrogen, oxygen, and carbon dioxide on the right. And you can see both of those flames are about the same size. They're captured at their same point in their expansion process, but they look very different, right? The one on the right has, we'll call it a lot of cells, or a high degree of wrinkling. That means it's a highly unstable flame. So it's going to behave much differently. It's going to have much different emissions and much different consumption processes because of the effective surface area. So this is one of the things that we look at in these constant volume combustion experiments is the propensity and the amount of instabilities that particular flame might produce, in addition to the emissions and the laminar burning velocity, and ultimately the minimum ignition energy, because we can vary the amount of power that's delivered between these two electrodes to produce the spherically expanding flame. Now, our initial set was done at ambient conditions. This is kind of a large amount of data just to show you that this design space is giant, right? And so we've done experiments where we are looking at different blends of hydrogen and ammonia. On the plot on your left, I've got kind of these parabolic shapes, and I'm going from down near the bottom in the yellow, or in the orange, which is 0% hydrogen, so 100% ammonia, all the way up to the top, which are the black triangles and diamonds coming from different studies, showing up to 60% hydrogen. And you can see that we are spanning a wide variety of laminar burning velocities across different equivalence ratios. So running from fuel lean to fuel rich. So fuel lean being less than equivalence ratio of 1, fuel rich being at equivalence ratios greater than 1. So we have this parabolic curve that is making these flames faster and slower, and also dependent upon how much hydrogen or how much ammonia is in it. So big design space. We've captured a lot of it experimentally. And we've also done some very detailed emission studies looking at the amount of NO, NO2, and N2O from each of these individual flames, and then kind of backing out the global warming potential that might happen from the production of NOx, because NOx, as well as CO2, is a greenhouse gas, and we need to be cognizant of our production of it. So while ammonia does not have carbon, does not mean that we're off the hook when it comes to considering global warming potentials. And so we did a couple years ago, we did this large sweep, was kind of like the most comprehensive study on ammonia hydrogen combustion. And we asked ourselves a couple of things. We said, well, where would we want to go next? One of which we want to go to even higher pressures. Our experiments, since they have those that visual aspect where we want to be able to look at those windows where we have those quartz windows sealed to metal, we have maximum pressures that are in the realm of 20 bar at the peak explosion, which means we start anywhere between 0 and 3 or 4 bar, which is not relevant if we're talking about internal combustion engines and their starting pressures. We want to go to much higher pressures so that we have what we would call engine relevant conditions, something you would see in a vehicle at top dead center. And so we've designed a new chamber that removes the windows. We become non-optical. So one of the trade-offs being we are able to go to, while we remove the ability to capture it using cameras, we can capture the behavior using pressure transducers and back out, we won't go through the derivations today, but back out what those laminar burning velocities are, but we can go to higher pressure. So this new chamber is designed for initial pressures up to 20 bar and maximum up to 200, right? So much higher temperatures, which will be much more relevant in engineering applications. We also wanted to be able to go to much lower temperatures, which kind of gets us to the original point of this talk, is going down to sub-zero conditions. And how might we do this? Well, I build a chamber, then I put it in an environmental chamber. So a constant volume combustion chamber inside an environmental chamber, which I'm showing on the right, the bottom right here. This environmental chamber is cooled by liquid nitrogen. It's capable of going down to -70 degrees Celsius. We typically operate down to negative 50 degrees Celsius because we can reach a nice steady state within our combustion chamber. Now, this is an engineering challenge for all the engineers in the room. Obviously, designing a system that can survive at negative 50 Celsius, all the sensors and seals associated with it become much more complex. Material survivability is always a concern, but to date we have a lot of data, some of which I'm going to show for the first time today. Is been the chamber has been quite reliable. And so our interest is what happens to these laminar burning. Our initial interest, and kind of where we're starting, is what happens to these laminar burning velocities as we go down in temperature. Before we get down to the lower temperatures, we have to commission our new experiment, and I get excited about this baselining exercise, which I know some of you might not be as excited about, but build a new chamber from scratch. And we fired it with a variety of fuels across a variety of equivalence ratios. So we've got methane, hydrogen, ammonia at room temperature, room pressure, and our experiments, which are shown in the black dots here, are right where they need to be. Now, a couple of things that I want to point out, and the real reason for showing this is that there's a lot of scatter in this data. Whereas laminar burning velocity is a fuel-air property mixture, there's a lot of error in everybody's measurements. I'm showing experiments that have ranged for the last 30 years. And so an exact measure, exact value for any pure fuel has not been agreed upon, because there are probably 30 years and 30 different methods for determining the canonical laminar burning velocity. But we do converge in most of these cases, especially for the fuels that we've seen a lot of, and we're happy with our performance in this. The lines here I'm showing are numerical simulations, which rely upon existing kinetic mechanisms, showing a couple here, some of which, the GRI mechanism is a very famous mechanism for predicting the performance of natural gas. We're using that as a baseline here, along with some published mechanisms, and these mechanisms are able to adequately predict it. So that becomes kind of a second thrust for our research: is, do existing kinetic mechanisms predict the behavior at low temperatures accurately? Because this is massively important with the fact that most application designs are not done by trial and error. They're done by numerical simulations and CFD analysis. And so if the kinetic mechanisms do not work at low temperatures, we need new kinetic mechanisms to be able to do adequate designs. And so we have started the process of looking at how these mechanisms behave at lower temperatures. So after we looked at the behavior of our known fuels and determined that we're doing a pretty good job of making those predictions, we start doing kind of extending out to the lower temperatures for the first time. There's basically two data sets that exist for hydrogen or ammonia, both of which are for hydrogen, both of which are for a single condition, 1 bar initial pressure and an equivalence ratio of 1, which is kind of like, wherever anybody would start. And those two data sets are shown in the plot on the right, to two different symbols, the green sideways triangle and the light blue sideways triangle, in conjunction with, and then a couple other predicted experiments, which are the X's, and then the lines are numerical models, and then the black bars are our data. And so we were able to run, we are in the realm of the existing experiments, and we were able to run at other conditions for hydrogen, pure hydrogen, down to an equivalence ratio of 0.8 at 1 bar. And we can start to see a couple of things. One is we agree with existing data, showing that our device is working quite well, and that we're agreeing relatively well, especially at 0.8, with the existing mechanisms. One from the literature, another one coming out of KAUST, a university in Saudi Arabia, of which is a very good group making mechanisms. And so can we push further? And so, in fact, we can. We start to push out, and we start to do ammonia at 3 different equivalence ratios here: 0.8, 1, and 1.2, at temperatures down to negative 50 Celsius. And we can see that as we get colder and colder and colder, so moving left on each of these plots, the velocity goes down and down and down. And recall that I said that at ambient conditions, ammonia's laminar burning velocity is about 7. Well, as you get colder, your laminar burning velocity, your consumption rate, goes down and down and down. And in fact, that gets well below 4, and down in the case of negative 50, you get down near to 2 centimeters per second, which is incredibly slow, right? A couple things to note here. I am heavily concerned at these very low conditions that buoyancy is going to dramatically affect our ability to adequately calculate the exact laminar burning velocity. And my group is already going through great lengths to be able to make these calculations as accurate as possible. But many of these rely upon assumptions like that this is actually a spherically expanding flame. And one kind of can imagine if something is heating up and going very slow, that it may rise like a balloon in my chamber. And I'll show you a picture in a second of when that is happening. If it does that, it may deform and therefore not be spherical. And therefore some of the assumptions made in calculating laminar burning velocity will be off. So we have to, basically create new paradigms for calculating the laminar burning velocity of spherically expanding flames. The other thing I would like to note is that the kinetic mechanisms, surprisingly, do a fairly good job, especially at the lean equivalence ratio 0.8 and an equivalence ratio of 1. Those lines are are in the realm of where our experimental data is, which is phenomenal considering that these mechanisms were created with data that was done at room temperature and way above, right? Using a rapid compression machine or other type of device that operates at very high temperatures, because typically that is where flames exist. Right? They do not operate in regimes that are this much less than zero. So therefore, I had concerns going into this, right? My hypothesis is that the mechanisms might have trouble capturing this behavior. However, they do a pretty good job at lean and stoichiometric conditions, but start to fall apart at rich conditions for pure ammonia. You can see on the plot on the right, those lines are drifting away from where the data exists. So it's something to keep our eye on, whether these mechanisms are properly tuned at the slightly more rich conditions. And so last data, and I know this is a little bit more down in the weeds than we've seen previously, but last bit is like what happens when I start to blend hydrogen with ammonia? Because if I am concerned about very low laminar burning velocities, I might want to blend hydrogen with it. I can do that relatively easy because oftentimes I have hydrogen available because that's what I use to make ammonia, or I can kind of do a reverse process, and you'll see in the literature and in process, we can crack ammonia into hydrogen relatively easily, especially if we have waste heat. Now, we took -50 Celsius as our coldest condition. We ran at 2 different blends of 80% ammonia and 70% ammonia with the balanced hydrogen. And we did these 3 different equivalence ratios again, and we wanted to see how the flames performed. We got the predicted increases in laminar burning velocity with small amounts of hydrogen. The mechanisms continue to perform okay. However, we can start to see that I would say at the richer conditions, again, at equivalence ratio of 1.2, those mechanisms start to disagree. So it's starting to become clear that we're going to have to do a lot of work on the mechanism side, right? And that's not just for me, that's for the engine designers and the device designers to be able to have a path forward. Now, conclusions, because I think I got 3 more minutes here. So, we've successfully constructed and verified a new non-optical high-pressure CVCC with sub-zero temperature capabilities. And this is something that's relatively novel in the space. We're excited about doing a lot of these experiments, and we've gone through the exercise of validating this against known fuels at known conditions, even extending down to some sub-zero conditions. And showing successful ignition of ammonia and ammonia hydrogen blends at these very, very low temperatures. Again, calling out concern with the buoyancy, right? I'm showing on the image here, this is some sweeps that I did for, on the bottom left image here, that's 0% hydrogen, 100% ammonia at a very lean condition. You can see the little balloon that is floating to the top. In that bottom left image, that's a highly buoyant flame, right? That is not behaving like the ones that are burning quickly in the top, in kind of the top images on this right. That's going to be a big issue for a lot of devices if we're that slow. And that's where we start to look where blending with hydrogen is going to be heavily necessary in existing kind of engine architectures. And then again, one of the places where we're looking to expand is looking at the mechanisms at rich conditions. We're also going to much higher pressures. As I mentioned earlier, we are pushing our capabilities up to initial pressures of 20 bar. We have the equipment in-house, and we're in the process of installing that. Moving on to studies on minimum ignition energies, moving on to studies on how emissions might look at these very low conditions and how those initial temperatures are going to affect emissions. And then looking at the CFD engine simulations at the end. Once we've fixed the mechanism issues and understand the flames, how do we get to design devices that are going to be able to operate at these conditions? Acknowledgements. First of all, thanks to the Office of Naval Research for funding this, and the UMass Lowell Center for Energy and Innovation for kind of housing a lot of this work. And none of this would be possible without the students. Alberto Aversa, which is a visiting MS student from TU Delft, was very instrumental in designing and commissioning this instrument, along with Damien Trinidad and Shubra Conti Das, both of which are my current students, and then two former students who graduated and did a lot of the early work in ammonia, Bello Navas and Nair Nassim, both of which are successfully completed their PhDs. My collaborators on this are Professor Noah Van Dam from here at UMass Lowell, Professor Demetrius Assanis from Stony Brook University, and Orion Welling, who works at the Cold Regions Laboratory up in New Hampshire, up from here, I guess, not from Alaska, where they're doing a lot of sub-zero work in a variety of different environments. With that, I appreciate your attention, and just showing on the right, that's my former master student, Alberto, our collaborative masters. A lot of this initial work went into his recently successfully defended master's thesis. With that, I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Hunter. That was great. I had a question, but actually I want to take a question from the participants first. JR has a question. Do you see, well, first of all, he loves science, which we probably already knew. So the question is, do you see a better method for EPA certification process for consumer engines? That is there a way with computer modeling that we could take the results of a defined set of engines on an alternative fuel blend, for example, methanol, ammonia, whatever, and extrapolate to how those engines would perform over engine life and across various models? It seems like there should be a way to do this without testing every single one, because every single engine model type for thousands of hours, and this kind of modeling seems like the key tool for doing so.
Yeah, you would hope, but a lot of times the certification process is the last place to kind of go digital, and that's my experience. And so while the hope would be there has to be a large amount of confidence in the tools that we have. And I think we're getting there such that commercial entities are using these tools in design, but much less in certification. I think that the hope and the kind of the more realistic short-term goal would be able to get to designs that are well validated before they're built, such that we have a high degree of confidence in their performance before they even get to certification. And so using that kind of like CFD in the loop for engine design is already part of the process now and will continue to grow. We just need to make sure that the tools, and I talked a lot about reaction mechanisms, which is just kind of one of the arrows in the quiver of an engine designer, but it has to be right before we get there. I would be very skeptical if we got to a certification that was solely reliant upon numerical processes.
Great. Okay, and I'll ask one more question. So you noted hydrogen can improve the low temperature burning, the velocity anyways, of ammonia. Do you have any guesses at like what percentage, like beyond a certain point, it doesn't help anymore, right? So do you have any guesses at what percentage that might be?
Well, it's interesting. A lot of the early research was saying, okay, what's the perfect blend of ammonia and hydrogen that I can get to look like natural gas from a pure like combustion velocity standpoint? Because then engines are already designed to kind of handle that kind of dynamics. And that number is about 30% hydrogen and ammonia. So that's what we've aimed at for a lot of, kind of standard temperature and standard operating regimes. I suspect that fraction is going to go up as we go up. Our initial test went up to that magical 30% point, but you can see that we're still well below the 35 centimeters per second, which is what we would aim for methane in an existing engine. So I suspect we're going to push up into the 50 and 60% hydrogen to be able to operate in that. And that's something that we're keeping our eye on.
Cool. Great. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And all right, so we are at the end of day one here. And I want to thank all the speakers, especially speakers and moderators, for your time today and your expertise. This was super fun for me. I really enjoyed this day, and we'll look forward to tomorrow. Let's see, and thank you all to all the attendees who are still here after this 4 hours or so of time together. And we look forward to seeing you all tomorrow at 8:30.